14 armed men stood in a half circle. In the center of that circle, on a cold concrete floor, sat the most feared crime boss in the city, hands bound behind him, face pale, bleeding internally from a wound that had been buying time for the last 90 minutes. And then the back office door opened. Clara Hayes walked out. No weapon, no backup. Just a medical bag and a decision she had made somewhere in the 3 minutes she spent inside a vault she was not supposed to leave. Victor Cross, the man who had just blown up a city block to get here, turned around slowly. He said, slowly, "Who are you?" She looked past him, straight at Dominic on the floor. She said, "His nurse. The only reason he is still alive right now. So I suggest you step back." Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. This is the story of a trauma nurse who walked into the wrong auction house, a mafia boss who couldn't let her walk away, and the war that forced both of them to decide what a human life is actually worth. Stay with us, because this is where it all begins. The ad was 3 lines long. Waitstaff needed. Private event. One night only. $500 cash. Clara Hayes found it at 11 at night, sitting at her kitchen table in her apartment on the 4th floor of a building that smelled of other people's cooking and the particular damp of a city that had been raining for 4 straight days. She was still in her scrubs. She had been home for 45 minutes after a 13-hour shift in the emergency room at Mercy General, and she had not yet eaten, and she had not yet showered. And spread out on the table in front of her were 7 unpaid bills that belonged to a man who was not her, and who had been generating unpaid bills for as long as she could remember. Her father's debt sat on her kitchen table like it always did, patient, heavy, completely indifferent to how tired she was. She was 34 years old. She had been a trauma nurse for 10 years. She had, in those 10 years, made exactly the kind of income that someone with her qualifications and her dedication and her record of 12-hour shifts made in a city that talked about healthcare workers the way it talked about good weather. Gratefully, briefly, and without any structural change to the underlying conditions. $500 was $500. She looked at the ad. She looked at the bills. She pressed confirm and went to bed. Her father had called that afternoon, the 3rd time that week, and she had let it go to voicemail again. She knew what the voicemail would say. She had been listening to variations of that voicemail for most of her adult life. Arthur Hayes was 58 years old, and he had the particular genius of a gambling addict for making the same catastrophic choices over and over in ways that were just different enough each time to make her wonder if this time was different. Before she remembered that it was not, she slept 6 hours. She got up. She drank coffee. She went to her shift. She did not listen to the voicemail until Thursday. The venue was on the east side of the city, in a neighborhood where things like venues existed without signage, where the architecture was old money rather than new construction, where the streets were swept at hours when most of the city was asleep. Clara arrived at 7 in the evening wearing the black uniform the agency had couriered to her apartment in a sealed bag, black trousers, black button-down shirt, white gloves thin enough to be elegant. She looked like every other server moving through the marble foyer of the building, which had no name on the door, which had a doorman in a 3-piece suit who looked at every arriving staff member once and then looked away, and whose single second of eye contact meant measured, assessed, approved inside. The auction had already begun. Clara had brought with her a set of expectations, antiques, paintings, the kind of objects rich people acquired to feel that their money had taste. What she found instead was harder to categorize. Display cases under low light, objects that she couldn't name, men in suits whose cost she estimated from the fabric and cut alone, speaking in voices kept carefully below the ambient noise of the room, women wearing jewelry that glittered without trying, the way very expensive things often did, as though effort was beneath them. She moved through the room with a silver tray of champagne flutes. She kept her eyes at the middle distance. She had learned to do that in the ER. The particular kind of present, but not intrusive attention that let you take in everything while appearing to see nothing in particular. It was useful in both environments. She noticed him at the center of the room before she noticed the guards. He was standing near the east wall, a whiskey glass in his right hand that had not moved in the 20 minutes she had been circulating. He was not performing ease the way most men in the room were performing ease. He simply occupied his space with a completeness that made the performance around him look thin. He was tall, dark-suited, somewhere between 40 and 45, with a face that had the look of something built for function rather than aesthetics, though it was not an unhandsome face. Dark eyes that moved across the room with a regularity and precision that Clara recognized, after a moment, as surveillance. He was not watching the auction. He was watching the room. She noted him the way she noted a patient's vitals. Factually, comprehensively, without attachment. Then she moved on. The first shot came 14 minutes later. It struck the chandelier directly above the main auction floor. 40 pounds of crystal and gilt dropping onto the people below in an instant cascade of sound that was enormous, and then immediately drowned by the screaming. Clara was already dropping to her knees before the second shot. The silver tray hitting the marble with a crash she did not register. Operating entirely on the training that had been drilled into her for 10 years. Get low, assess. Move, smoke was filling the room. Not fire smoke. The thick, controlled gray of a canister. Someone wanted disorientation, not mass casualties. She absorbed this assessment in 4 seconds and began moving toward the east wall, staying low, calculating. Exits, number of people between her and the nearest one. The fastest route that kept her out of the sightlines she was identifying from the direction of the shots. A hand caught her arm in the dark. She turned her head. It was the man from the east wall, the chess player. He was moving with a controlled urgency that was entirely different from the panic moving through the room around him. He had clearly planned for exactly this, or something enough like it, and he pulled her sideways into a narrow alcove behind a velvet curtain, with a grip that was firm but not brutal, and without a word of explanation. She opened her mouth. His hand came over it, not hard, just definite. He pressed his back flat against the wall, and she was pressed against the wall beside him. And through the gap in the curtain she could see, very clearly, 3 men moving through the thinning smoke with weapons drawn and the particular focused patience of people who were looking for something specific. Someone specific. She understood immediately. She was not the target. She was a complication. He understood this at the same time she did. She felt him assess the gap in the curtain, felt the calculation happening in real time, and then his head dipped and his mouth covered hers. It was not a kiss in any sense she recognized. It was a mask. He had angled his face so that anyone glancing through the gap in the curtain would see 2 shadows in an embrace, not a man's profile. Not a face that could be identified in the dim light of a canistered room. 2 people, anonymous, occupied with each other in the way that people sometimes were when the world went chaotic around them. She went still. She put her fingers flat against his chest, feeling the lapels of the expensive jacket, and she counted silently. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. The footsteps moved away. He pulled back. His eyes met hers in the dark of the alcove. She had approximately 1 second to register them. Very dark, almost black in the dim light. Looking at her with an expression that she could not read at all, which was unusual, because she could almost always read people. Then the sirens began. Distant at first, then not distant. The grip on her arm loosened for exactly half a second. Clara Hayes took that half second. She pushed through the gap in the curtain and moved low and fast toward the emergency exit she had identified on her way in. The one on the north wall, with the green light above it that pulsed faintly in the smoke. She hit the bar. The door swung open, and the cold night air came at her like something clean and necessary. She ran 3 blocks. She stopped on a corner under a streetlight and stood with her white-gloved hands pressed over her mouth, breathing hard. Feeling the city's cold air fill her chest and stabilize her heart rate, she was still in her server uniform. She had no money. She had not been paid the $500 she had needed badly enough to show up to an event that turned out to have assassins in it. She stood under the streetlight for 30 seconds. Then she opened her rideshare app and ordered a car. She stood there waiting. And she thought, one night. That is what this was. A chaotic one-night event that she happened to be present for. She had not been the target. She had not been hurt. She was going home, and she was going to shower, and she was going to sleep. And tomorrow, she would start a double shift at Mercy General, and this would become a story she told once and then set down. She pressed her gloved fingers against her mouth for a moment, exactly once, as if verifying something. Then she pulled them away. The car arrived. She got in. She told the driver the address. She looked out the window at the city as it moved past her, ordinary and indifferent. And she thought, I was never really there, a ghost in a rich man's war. She believed it, completely. The way you can believe something when the alternative is too large to accommodate. She did not look back. She could not have known, as the car moved through the streets. That 3 blocks behind her in the ruined auction house, a man was standing very still in the smoke, one hand pressed against the left side of his jacket, watching the door through which she had disappeared. Could not have known that in the 8 seconds they had been in the alcove together. He had memorized the angle of her face in the lamplight, the specific quality of her stillness. The way she had gone completely calm when most people went completely the opposite. She did not know that a man who ruled a city's shadows had just decided, with the same thoroughness he applied to everything, that he would find out exactly who she was. She went home. She set her alarm for 5:30. She fell asleep telling herself she was safe. Clara's life, in the 5 days following the auction, followed the rhythm it had followed for 10 years. She was up at 5:30. She was in the shower by 5:35. She was out the door by 6:10, having eaten a piece of toast and drunk enough coffee to be functional. Stopping at the cart on the corner run by a man named Marcus, who had a green awning and always added an extra espresso shot without being asked. Because he had been watching Clara Hayes leave for the hospital for 4 years, and he understood what the hours required. She worked her shifts. She triaged. She sutured. She consoled. She administered medications and reviewed charts and talked with families in the way that families needed to be talked with, which was carefully and honestly, and without any falseness about what the numbers meant. She trained 2 residents, the kind who were good but uncertain, who needed someone to show them that uncertainty was information rather than failure. She wrote her incident reports. She ate in the break room in 12-minute bursts. She was in the hospital, the person she had always been. Competent and precise and genuinely devoted to the work in a way that was not performance and was not exhausted compliance, but was the specific orientation of someone who had decided, at 19, that this was the thing she was made for, and had spent 15 years proving it. Outside the hospital, she was managing. She called the catering agency 3 times about the $500. She was told twice that it was being processed, and once that there had been a scheduling irregularity and the payment would be reviewed. She accepted that this meant she was not going to see the money and moved on. She called 2 of the debt numbers from her father's bills and negotiated payment arrangements that would require her to work an extra shift per week for the next 6 months. She did not call the 3rd number, because the 3rd number was the one that had been left by the 3 men in her father's apartment, the one that had been written on the napkin that she had folded into her pocket the week before the auction. And she was still deciding how to approach that. Her father called on Tuesday. She let it go to voicemail. He called again on Thursday. This time she answered, because she always eventually answered. because despite everything, she was still the kind of person who could not sustain the hardness that would be required to stop. Arthur Hayes sounded like he sounded when he was afraid, which was different from how he sounded when he was guilty, and different again from how he sounded when he was in the particular combination of both that she had been interpreting since she was 12. This call had all three tones running underneath his ordinary words like a current under water. He asked her how she was. She said fine. He asked about work. She said busy. He said he was working on some things. She said she hoped so. They talked for 4 minutes without either of them saying anything actual, which was a kind of conversation she had been fluent in since childhood. And when she hung up, she sat in the break room for a moment and felt the particular exhaustion that had nothing to do with the number of hours she'd worked. Sarah Jenkins found her there. Sarah was 35 and had been in the trauma bay for 8 years and had the quality that Clara most valued in a colleague and a friend, which was the ability to sit with someone in the middle of something without trying to resolve it into a lesson or a plan. She brought 2 cups of the bad vending machine coffee, which was a gesture because Sarah knew Clara hated the vending machine coffee, and she sat across from her and waited. Clara told her about the auction. Not all of it. She described it as a catering job that had gotten strange, which was accurate as far as it went. She mentioned the gunfire without mentioning the alcove or the man. She called it a close call and shrugged, Sarah said. You need to pick better side hustles. Clara laughed. It was brief and genuine, and it helped. She went back out to the trauma bay and felt, for the rest of the shift, like herself. She believed she was safe. The black SUV appeared on a Wednesday. Clara was crossing the hospital parking garage on level 2 at 7:45 in the evening, her bag over her shoulder, her keys in her right hand. She was thinking about the patient she'd seen at 6. A 17-year-old brought in with chest pain that turned out to be costochondritis, not cardiac, and the relief on the mother's face when Clara had explained this. The specific physical release of a fear that had been enormous and was suddenly gone. She was thinking about that, and about the dinner she had not yet decided on, and about the scheduling irregularity in next week's roster, which was going to require her to swap a shift. She was not thinking about what came next. The SUV pulled forward and blocked the lane in front of her car. She stopped. The door opened on the driver's side. The man who got out was large and moved with the deliberate, unhurried pace of someone who was not anticipating resistance. Clara's field of vision widened. Left, another man was there. He had been leaning against a concrete pillar, arms folded, waiting. She turned right. A third, coming from the direction of the elevator bank. She was a trauma nurse. She was not a person who panicked in high-pressure situations. She was also not a person who simply accepted a situation without attempting to alter it, because in 10 years in an ER, acceptance without action had never once been the right call. She had 3 seconds of rapid assessment. The garage was mostly empty. The nearest other car was 40 feet away. Screaming might bring someone from the stairwell, but probably not in time. And these 3 men were positioned correctly to prevent all her exits. She could run toward the elevator and likely be caught before she reached it. She could create noise and delay. She threw her car keys at the nearest man, hard, flat, aimed at his face. He deflected them. She grabbed the concrete pillar and tried to pivot around it. The man from the left caught her upper arm with practiced efficiency, turning her toward the vehicle with a pressure that was inexorable without being violent, the way a very strong current is inexorable. And she spent the next 5 minutes to the drive, noting every turn she could see through the tinted window and building a route in her head that she might never have occasion to use. They went north, past the edge of the downtown grid, into the old industrial quarter that had been slowly converting itself for 10 years. The warehouse facades and old brick becoming expensive and quiet. The building they stopped at looked like a renovated warehouse from the outside. Iron gates, security cameras at every angle. Four men at the entrance who watched the vehicle arrive with the particular stillness of people for whom watching vehicles arrive was their actual job. Inside was nothing like a warehouse. The floors were hardwood, the lighting was recessed. The quiet was the deliberate, expensive kind that required investment to maintain. She was walked down a corridor and brought to a room with a desk, two chairs, and a window that looked out on a gray inner courtyard. Dominic Vance was standing with his back to her. He turned around slowly when she was brought in. She recognized him at once. The east wall, the chess player's stillness, the untouched whiskey glass. He was looking at her now the way he had looked at the auction room, with that comprehensive, unperforming attention. And she understood that he was not surprised to see her, because he had arranged for her to be here, and had known all along what she looked like. He said, "Please sit down," Clara said. No, he considered that for a moment. Something moved briefly in his face. Something that wasn't quite amusement and was too controlled to be curiosity. He sat down, amused himself, and placed his hands flat on the desk. He said, "I have something to tell you. I prefer to tell you now rather than later, because I don't find delayed disclosure useful," Clara said. "I'd rather be home," he said. "I understand. Your father's name is Arthur Hayes. He is currently $40 in debt to a family called the Sterlings. He began clearing part of that debt 6 weeks ago by providing Eleanor Sterling's people with your work schedule and a physical description. You were placed at the auction to serve as a field intelligence asset. You were not meant to be in danger. You were meant to observe and report." Clara went completely still. She said, "That is not possible," he said. "I know that's the preferred response." He picked up a manila folder from the desk and moved it toward her across the surface without pushing it, simply placing it in reach. She did not move for 4 seconds. Then she crossed the room and opened it. Photographs. Her father. Meeting a man she didn't know in a diner parking lot. The timestamp visible in the lower right corner. Her father. Accepting an envelope. Her father's handwriting, which she knew as well as her own. On what she recognized immediately as the monthly schedule she had given him 2 months ago, when she'd asked him to call before visiting so she could make sure she was home. She had given him the schedule as a kindness. She looked at the photographs for a long time. Long enough that the room around her ceased to matter. Long enough to feel what it felt like to look at a wall you had built part of your life against and discover it was a painted backdrop. She closed the folder. She said, "Why are you telling me this?" He said, "Because you have 2 options. You leave here right now, unprotected, and within 48 hours Eleanor Sterling's Heights people will collect you to ensure you can't speak about what you witnessed at the auction. Or you stay here, temporarily, while I negotiate a resolution." Clara looked around the room. Hardwood floors. Security cameras she could now identify in the corners. The 4 men at the door down the corridor. She said, "You're offering me a cage," he said. "I'm offering you a cage with a lock you partially control. The alternative is no cage at all, which in the current environment is more dangerous," she said. "And if I want neither option," he said, "then you take your chances alone. I can't predict what happens then." She stood still. She was 34 years old. She had rebuilt her life from her father's wreckage more times than she had counted. She had walked into a burning building of a hospital shift 4 nights ago and managed 9 critical cases in 12 hours. She had never in her adult life been in a position where she did not have a move. This felt, for the first time, like that. She said, "I want my own room, a lock on the door that I control. And I want access to medical supplies." He said, "Those are all manageable." She said, "I'm not staying because I trust you. I'm staying because right now you happen to be the option with the most predictable risks." He said, "That's a rational assessment." She said, "I'm a rational person." She walked past him to the window and looked out at the gray courtyard. The city was a specific deep tone of gray she knew from the hospital windows. The particular midweek November gray that felt permanent even when you knew it wasn't, she said, without turning around. "What are you going to do about my father?" He said, "I'll find him and make sure he's safe." That's the most I can offer. She said nothing. He said, I know that's insufficient. She said, yes. She pressed her forehead briefly against the cold glass. Then she straightened up. She turned around. She looked at Dominic Vance with the same direct, assessing look she used when she needed to understand exactly what she was dealing with. She said, I'll need a list of what medical supplies you have on the premises, he said. I'll have someone get you that tonight, she said. Thank you. She said it neutrally, not warmly. It was the kind of thank you she gave to hospital administrators who provided necessary resources. Acknowledgement of function, not relationship. She walked to the door and stopped, she said, without turning. The men who brought me here. The one on the left had a hand tremor. Has had it for a while. From the way it settled into his grip pattern. You should have someone look at it. A silence behind her. She walked out, in her room on the second floor, with the lock tested twice and found to be real. She lay on her back on the unfamiliar bed and looked at the ceiling and allowed herself, finally, in private, to feel everything she had been not feeling since she opened the folder. Her father had known where she would be, had made arrangements for her to be there, had calculated, somewhere in the part of himself that was always calculating odds and returns, that her proximity to the Sterling operation was worth something, had folded her into his accounting without telling her, without asking her, without once considering that the word she had for this, the specific word, was betrayal. She stayed with that for a while. Then she got up. She found a piece of paper in the desk drawer and a pen, and she began to make notes. The quarter layout she'd memorized, the camera positions she'd identified, the security rotation she'd observed from the window, the delivery schedule she intended to watch for. She was Clara Hayes. She was going to find a way out. She always found a way. The compound had its own logic, and Clara spent 48 hours learning it. The ground floor was operational. Offices, a communication hub that hummed with a focused, concentrated energy. A security monitoring room that she could see into briefly through an open door and which had the air of a place that never entirely powered down. The second floor was residential, and it surprised her because it had been finished with a genuine care for comfort, proper beds with proper mattresses, bathrooms with actual hot water, small sitting areas with books in them, some of which showed evidence of being read. The third floor was off limits. She was told this once, by a man named Marco, and the way he said it made it clear that the statement was not an invitation to negotiate. She settled into her room. She mapped the corridors she was permitted to access. She watched the shifts change. 6 in the morning, 6 in the evening, reliable as a hospital schedule. She counted security positions. She noted which men spoke to each other and which didn't, which ones were young enough to be uncertain, and which had the settled quality of people who had been here long enough to stop assessing every variable. On the third morning, she found the supply room. It was at the east end of the ground floor corridor, used as a storage area for first aid materials. The supplies were there, but they were wrong. Bandages expired or incorrectly stored, antiseptic not sorted by concentration. Suture kits mixed in with dressings in a way that would waste critical time in an emergency. A small collection of prescription medications, labels still on, sitting loose in a cardboard box without any log or system. Clara went to find Marco. He was in the hallway near the security hub. He was 28 and had the particular physical quality of a man who had spent his formative years being told that his size was sufficient preparation for everything. She said, I want to talk to you about the supply room. He said, what about it? She said, I want to set it up as a proper clinic, small but functional. If you have people working in a compound like this one, someone is going to need medical attention at some point. Probably someone already needs it and isn't saying so. He stared at her as though she had said something in a language he didn't entirely speak. She said, I'm not asking for freedom of movement. I'm asking permission to be useful within the space I already have. Those are different things. He went away. He came back 22 minutes later and told her the boss said she could use the room for whatever she needed. Clara spent the rest of that day and half of the next establishing something workable. She discarded what was expired. She organized what remained by function and date. She created a proper triage system using a logbook she found in the office supplies and a notation format she had developed in her second year in the ER, clean and fast and comprehensive. She established a protocol sheet for the most likely situations: laceration management, fracture assessment, respiratory distress, allergic reaction. She taped it inside the supply cabinet door. When she was done, it was not a clinic in any official sense. It was a room with organized supplies, and a clear system and a person who knew what to do with them. The first patient came the following morning. He was 23 years old, perimeter guard, which she knew from the uniform and the calluses, and the way he held himself. He had a laceration on his right forearm that was 7 days old, and had been treated with the particular combination of duct tape and wishful thinking that she had seen in the ER more times than she could count, in people who believed medical attention was something they could negotiate themselves out of needing. He sat in the chair she placed at the improvised treatment table with the stiffness of someone expecting pain and not wanting to show it. She cleaned the wound first, properly, which meant it stung, and he didn't move. She confirmed there was no infection, which was good fortune given 7 days of tape management. She sutured it with the efficiency of someone who had done this approximately 40 times. And she worked without unnecessary conversation, because she had found that patients who were managing discomfort did better with silence than with talk. When she was finished, she said, "Next time, don't wait 7 days." He said, "Yes." "Ma'am," she said. "How old are you?" He said, 23. She said, "You have good tissue quality. This will heal clean. Eat more protein." He left looking vaguely confused, as though he had come in expecting a transaction and received something that did not fit the category. Word moved through the compound the way word always moved through closed communities, quickly and with embellishment. By the next afternoon, she had 4 more patients, a wrist sprain, significantly worse than the man presenting it had been willing to admit. A case of hypertension in a 44-year-old that she assessed with a blood pressure cuff she had found in the supply box, and which produced numbers that alarmed her considerably, because this was not recent and was not being managed. A young man who had convinced himself that a dental abscess was a sign of cardiac failure, which she clarified with enough specificity that he left visibly lighter. A 19-year-old woman with a finger that had been broken 6 months ago and set incorrectly, which had healed wrong. She reset the finger. The woman did not cry, which told Clara something about the compound's implicit expectations regarding displayed pain. She gave her a proper splint improvised from materials she had found and told her she needed a real X-ray at some point. The woman said, "Thank you." Clara said, "Come back in 5 days and I'll check the alignment," she began, against her better strategic judgment, to understand the shape of the place. It was not a place designed around cruelty. It was a place designed around control, which was different. And the difference mattered. A system built for control could have people in it who were not cruel, but who had simply never been offered a different framework for thinking about the people around them. The care she was providing was not something anyone here would have described as missing, because it had never been installed as a category of the possible. She thought about that between patients. She was thinking about it when Dominic came to the clinic on the 6th day. She heard him in the way she always heard him in the compound, through the quality of the silence that preceded him. There was a specific shift in how people in corridors near him adjusted their comportment, subtle but consistent, the way water adjusts around a moving object. Then the door to the supply room opened. He was holding his left side. Not dramatically. He was standing upright and his expression was the usual controlled blankness. But she was a trauma nurse. And one of the things 10 years in a trauma bay teaches you is the specific way a person holds themselves when they are managing significant pain with discipline. And she recognized it in under 2 seconds. She said, "Sit down," he said. She said, "The chair. Please." There was a pause. He sat, she crossed to him and put on her gloves. She unbuttoned the side of his shirt with professional, entirely impersonal hands. The laceration was on his left side, starting at the lower rib margin and extending 8 centimeters. It had been dressed at some point, poorly, and the dressing had shifted. The wound had reopened. There was the beginning of inflammation at the margins that told her this had been left too long. She said, "When did this happen?" He said, "Yesterday afternoon." She said, "Who treated it initially?" He said, "I did." She looked up at him briefly. He held the look without expression. She said, "The initial closure was too tight at the surface and didn't address the deeper tissue layers. You're going to develop a significant infection within 24 hours if we leave it as is. I need to open it, clean it properly, and suture it correctly." He said, "Do what needs to be done." She assembled her materials. Proper antiseptic. Suture thread in the correct grade for the depth. The limited supply of local anesthetic, which she would use sparingly. She worked without wasted movement, which was the habit of someone who had done this work in conditions where every second had weight. She cleaned the wound first. Antiseptic into an open wound was unpleasant by any measure, and he did not move. She injected the local anesthetic and waited, counting the 90 seconds under her breath. Then she began to suture. He was exceptionally still. Most people made small involuntary adjustments during suturing, tiny protests from the body, even when the mind was committed to stillness. He made none. She found herself aware of this without wanting to be. They were 4 minutes into the procedure when he said, "Why did you establish the clinic?" She said, "Because the people here were being injured and not receiving proper treatment." He said, "You were meant to be waiting for me to resolve your situation, not treating my guards." She said, "Someone was walking around with an infected laceration for 7 days. The woman with the broken finger had it set wrong 6 months ago, and it's affecting her grip. The man with the elevated blood pressure has readings that could produce a cardiac event within the next year if they're not managed." She paused to reposition and continue. She said, "I can't see those things and not address them. That's simply not how I function." He said, "Even here," she said, "especially here." Actually, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You know you could use that needle for purposes other than suturing." She did not pause. She did not look up. She said, "I know." He said, "So why don't you? You're trapped here against your will. I would think the calculation is straightforward." She stopped working, not from hesitation, from the need to say it's the next thing correctly. Because it was the thing she had believed for her entire professional life, and she rarely had occasion to state it to anyone. She said, "Every person who comes to my table has equal weight, not equal moral weight, not equal value to the world's accounting. Equal weight on my table. The moment I start deciding whose body deserves care and whose doesn't, based on what they've done or who they are, I lose the thing that makes what I do meaningful." She looked at him then, briefly, directly. She said, "You buy people, Dominic. You arrange them and move them and assign them value based on what they're worth to your operations. I heal them. I heal them regardless of what your accounting says about them. That's the difference between what you do and what I do." She went back to work. A long silence. He said nothing. She sutured. The clinical quiet of the room settled around them, and she finished the procedure with the same precision she had brought to the beginning of it. She tied off the final suture. She cut the thread. She covered the wound with a proper dressing and stepped back and stripped her gloves. She said, "No strenuous activity for 5 days. I know you'll ignore that recommendation, but the parameters exist regardless. Take these twice a day and do not skip doses." She held out a strip of antibiotics from her dwindling supply. "Come back in 3 days so I can assess the closure." He took the antibiotics. He looked at the strip for a moment. He looked at her. He said, I've employed surgeons who charged $10 and were less efficient, she said. I'm sure they also thanked you for the business. A silence. Something shifted in his expression, not a smile. A re-examination, he said. How did you come to be in emergency medicine? She said. I wanted to be somewhere the work was real, he said. You could have gone into private practice. Considerably more money, she said. I had the same conversation with my first-year advisor. I gave her the same answer, he said. Your father's situation suggests money matters to you. She went still. The temperature in the room dropped in a way that had nothing to do with the ventilation. She said his situation is his. I'm managing the consequences because there was no other option, and I am apparently constitutionally unable to let the consequences fall on him rather than working myself to death preventing it. That has nothing to do with why I became a nurse. He said I didn't say it did. She said, didn't you? He said, no. I was making an observation about your circumstances. I wasn't making a judgment about your motivations. She looked at him carefully. She believed him, which irritated her somewhat, he said. The man with the blood pressure, Martinez. He's been with me for 11 years, she said. Then he should have been managing his blood pressure for at least the last 3 of them. His readings are dangerous. He needs medication and consistent monitoring, he said. I'll get him what he needs, she said. Good. He stood, carefully, feeling the sutures with a brief touch, testing rather than doubting. He nodded once, which she understood as acknowledgement of the work rather than personal gratitude, and walked toward the door. At the threshold, he paused. He said, the man with the tremor that you mentioned to Marco. She said yes, he said. What is it? She said, I'd need to assess him properly. But the pattern suggests an essential tremor, which is benign but uncomfortable and will worsen under sustained stress. There are medications that help. He said, I'll send him to you. He left. She stood in the clinic after he was gone, in the quiet that settled when he left a room. And she noticed that the quiet was a different quality than the quiet when other people left. She put that observation in a box and closed the box, and turned her attention to restocking her supply log. That evening, in her room, she took out the paperback novel she'd found on the second-floor bookshelf, a thriller with no particular distinction, and in the margins of pages 47 through 52 she wrote in her small, neat handwriting the accumulated intelligence she had been building. The medical supply delivery arrived on Wednesdays. The truck came to the east gate. During the delivery, there was a 40-second window in which the camera coverage on the east corridor overlapped poorly. A blind spot she had identified from the position of 2 cameras she could see from the second-floor landing. She would need to confirm this with one more Wednesday, then she would move. She wrote it all in the margins. She closed the book. She set it on the nightstand with the spine showing. Nothing remarkable, just a novel. The kind of thing that people left in rooms for other people to read, she thought, before she slept. About the way Dominic had said, I'm telling you, not judging you. She thought about the way she had believed it. She told herself it was simply the result of being confined in a space with a limited number of people for 6 days. A kind of natural recalibration of threat assessment. It was not more than that. It was proximity and limited options, and the entirely human tendency to find complexity in people who were close. She fell asleep. In the morning, she went back to the clinic. Her 6th patient was Martinez. He sat in the chair with the wariness of a man who had been told to do something by someone he didn't disobey. And he watched her set up the blood pressure cuff with the particular expression of a person who expected the worst. His systolic was 168. His diastolic was 104. She looked at the reading and then at him. She said, How long have you had headaches in the morning? He said, slowly. A few years, she said. Any vision changes? Moments where things go briefly bright or blurry, he said. Sometimes, she said. Left arm weakness. Shortness of breath with exertion. He said some. Yeah, she said. Martinez, how old are you? He said. 44. She said. You have 11 years to go before you hit 55, which is when statistically, these numbers become even more dangerous. But they're already dangerous now. You've been having warning signs for years. How are you still here and not having had a stroke? He said, slowly. Good luck, she said. We're going to need more than luck. She wrote him a medication regimen. She wrote it on a proper form. Or the closest thing to a proper form she could create with what she had. She explained the medications, the timing, the dietary changes that would help, the ones that would not be optional. She told him to come back in 7 days for a follow-up reading. He said, Is it really that bad? She said, Yes. I want to be honest with you about that, because I think you deserve a clear picture rather than something softened, but manageable. Genuinely manageable if you're consistent. He said, Okay. She said, Okay. He left, and she wrote up the patient log. And she thought, This is what I do. In whatever room I find myself in. This is what I do, she thought. 4 more days until the next Wednesday delivery, she thought. I'll be out of here before the following Wednesday. She made herself believe it. She needed to believe it. Because the alternative, the possibility that she was settling into this place, finding something like function in it, was a thought she could not afford to entertain. She closed the patient log. She straightened the supply shelves. She went to the window and looked out at the gray courtyard, and she watched. And she counted, and she planned. The escape went better than she expected, until it didn't. The Wednesday came. Clara was at the second-floor landing window by 2:15 in the afternoon, watching the east gate. The delivery had arrived at 2:50 the previous Wednesday, and at 2:53 the Wednesday before that. She had a window of uncertainty of perhaps 10 minutes on either side of the 2:50 mark. The truck arrived at 2:35. 15 minutes early. She nearly missed it. She was at the window, not in position, and she had half a second to process what she was seeing before her body was already moving. She grabbed her jacket. She took the canvas bag she had quietly assembled in her room over the past 3 days. A portable collection of the most critical and least bulky supplies from the clinic, bandages, antiseptic, the vial of morphine she had decided, on instinct, might be important, a suture kit, her patient log notebook, and her phone, which she had been charging at a wall outlet in the clinic and which she had been keeping turned off to conserve battery. She moved. The service corridor on the ground floor ran parallel to the east delivery route. She reached it from the second-floor stairwell, moving at the pace of someone who had somewhere to be but was not running. Because running in corridors attracted attention and ordinary purposeful movement generally didn't. She counted 2 security personnel in the east ground floor corridor. Both were occupied. She moved past the first without incident. The second glanced up. She was already past his field of clear vision before the glance registered her. The 40-second camera gap. She reached the loading dock. The truck's rear doors were open. The driver was at the front of the vehicle with his manifest, checking off items against a printed list, which meant he was occupied and his back was to the dock. She was in the back of the truck and behind a wall of cardboard boxes before she'd made a conscious decision about any of the individual steps. Training made it smooth. Planning made it faster. The doors closed 8 minutes later. From the outside, the distinctive thunk of someone closing up without checking the interior. The truck began to move. She rode in the back for 22 minutes. She spent the time taking slow, controlled breaths and monitoring the truck's turns in relation to the general direction of travel, building a spatial map she might need. She estimated they were moving southeast and then south, which would put them in the commercial district rather than the residential sectors, which was actually useful. When the truck slowed into what felt like an urban stop-and-go pattern, she listened through the metal wall for the particular acoustic quality of a commercial street. The overlapping sounds of delivery vehicles and foot traffic and cross-street noise. She heard it. She found the interior bar for the rear doors and pressed it. The door swung open onto a side street lined with loading bays. She dropped to the ground, pulled the door closed behind her, and walked 4 blocks to the transit line. She kept her jacket closed and her bag on her shoulder and her face at the ordinary urban angle of someone who was going somewhere ordinary. She changed buses twice, backtracking once to break any pattern. She was at Sarah's apartment building by 6:05 in the evening. She stood on the sidewalk for a moment and allowed herself to feel the specific relief of having done a difficult thing correctly. It was brief. She was practiced at giving herself brief moments and then moving on. She buzzed Sarah's apartment. The speaker clicked. Sarah's voice said, "Who is it?" Clara said, "It's me," a silence. Just a half second. Just enough to register before the door buzzed open. Clara went up the stairs and down the hallway she had walked 100 times. To the door she knew, and Sarah opened it before she knocked. Sarah Jenkins was 35 years old and had the face of someone who had grown up wanting to help people and had spent 8 years in a trauma bay learning that wanting to help and being able to help were two different things that you had to reconcile every single day. She had warm brown eyes and the kind of energy that, in normal circumstances, made a room feel slightly more manageable. Right now, her face was cycling through expressions that Clara read in the span of 3 seconds. Relief, fear, guilt, love. And something else underneath all of them that she couldn't immediately name. Sarah said, "Clara, oh God, come in, come in." Clara came in. The apartment was familiar, in the way that places where you've spent significant time become familiar. The particular geography of the furniture. The crayons and drawings pinned to the refrigerator that her children Eli and Mara had made. The pair of small shoes left precisely beside the front door. The smell of something good from the kitchen. Eli and Mara were at their grandmother's for the week. The apartment had the quality of a home between occupancies, which was both lonely and also, right now, a relief. Clara set her bag down and sat on the couch. She felt her shoulders do something she had not been aware of them doing, which was drop. Just come down from wherever they had been for 9 days into a more human position, she said. I've been held at a compound north of the city. I can't explain everything right now. I needed to get somewhere safe first. Sarah sat across from her in the armchair, pulling her knees to her chest. Clara said, "The man who had me taken there is named Dominic Vance. He's the head of the Vance Syndicate. I know that sounds like something out of a film. But I was at an auction where someone tried to assassinate him and I was in the wrong place," Sarah said, quietly. "Are you hurt?" Clara said, "No, he hasn't hurt me. It's complicated. I've been treating his people. That's its own story. But I need to figure out what to do next. And I needed one night where I was somewhere I could think." Sarah said, "Of course. Of course you can stay." She said it in the voice of someone who meant it entirely, and simultaneously in the voice of someone who was holding something behind it. But Clara was exhausted in ways that went past the bones, and the couch was familiar, and the apartment was warm. And she told herself she was reading too much into Sarah's tone because she'd been in a compound for 9 days, and her calibration was off. Sarah went to the kitchen. She came back with a blanket and then, a few minutes later, with tea, hot, sweet, with precisely the right ratio that Clara had never needed to specify because Sarah had been making it for her for 8 years. It was an entirely ordinary act of friendship, and it made the back of Clara's throat tighten in a way she controlled by focusing on the mug. Sarah sat back down. She said, "Start from the beginning." The whole thing. Clara talked. She told her about the auction, properly this time, including the man and the alcove and the kiss she had described earlier as a close call without specifics. She told her about the compound and the clinic and the 9 days of careful observation. She told her about her father's photographs in the Manila folder. When she got to the part about her father, she stopped for a moment. She said, "I've been trying to decide how to feel about that part," Sarah said. "What did he do?" Clara said. "He sold my schedule to the people who were trying to use me as bait. He put me in the middle of a mafia assassination attempt without telling me," Sarah said. very quietly. "Oh, Clara," Clara said. "I know," Sarah said. "He's your father," Clara said. "I know that too." She picked up the tea. The warmth of it moved through her hands and up her arms. She drank. The familiar sweetness. She said, "I need one night to sleep properly, and then I need to think clearly about the next step. I've been planning." But planning in captivity is limited because you can't verify everything you're working with. "I need to be somewhere outside to make proper decisions," Sarah said. "You can have as many nights as you need," Clara said. "Just one. I don't want to put you in a position. If anyone is looking for me," Sarah said. "Stay, please." Clara nodded. She drank more tea. The warmth spread further. It was very good tea. It was perfect tea. She was more tired than she had understood herself to be, and the tea was perfect, and the couch was soft, and the apartment around her had the particular comfortable disorder of a place where a working single mother allowed herself to stop cleaning at the point of genuine exhaustion, which Clara found more comforting than tidiness. She said, "Your kids are okay," Sarah said. "They're great. Eli made the football team. Mara is obsessed with drawing horses right now. I'm going to find horse drawings in every pocket I own for the next year." Clara smiled. It was brief and genuine. She said, "That sounds about right." She drank more tea. The room tilted slightly. She set the mug down and blinked. The tilt was still there. It did not correct the way the usual tiredness tilt corrected when you sat still for a moment. It was a different kind of tilt. A chemical kind. She looked at the mug. She looked at Sarah. Sarah's face had gone a specific shade of pale that Clara had seen in the ER, on people who were about to hear very bad news and who already knew, at some cellular level, that the news was coming. Sarah was sitting very straight. Her hands were wrapped around her own mug. She was looking at Clara with an expression that was the most complicated assemblage of emotions that Clara had seen in 9 days of complicated things. Guilt, terror, love, desperation. All of them simultaneously. All of them absolutely genuine. None of them contradictory. Clara said. Sarah's voice was already breaking when she said, "I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry." "Clara," she said she would kill them. She said she knew where they go to school. She knew their names. She knew Eli's teacher's name. She knew Mara's bus number. She knew everything. Clara and I had no. I couldn't. There was no choice I could make that wasn't. She pressed her hand over her mouth. She said, through it, "My children. They're 7 and 9 years old." Clara said. "Who?" Sarah said. "Eleanor Sterling. She called me 3 days ago. She has people everywhere," she said. "She said she knew you would contact me first. She said if I didn't call her when you called me, she would." She couldn't finish the sentence. Clara's vision was blurring at the margins now. The sedative, whatever it was well chosen and efficient. She tried to stand and found the connection between intention and execution had become unreliable. She said, "You could have." Sarah said, crying now. "She was monitoring my phone. Clara, I couldn't. I tried to think of a way. I thought about it for 3 days. I couldn't find one." Clara said, "Your kids." Sarah said, "What?" Clara said, carefully. Through the increasing softness that was replacing the edges of her perception. "Your kids are the reason you did this. That's a reason. That is an actual reason." She said it because it was true. Because she was trained to see the complete picture, not the convenient version. Because Sarah Jenkins was her closest friend and her closest friend had betrayed her in the most painful possible way, and had done it to protect 2 children who were 7 and 9 years old and whose names Eleanor Sterling had known along with their teacher and their bus number. Clara said, "Tell them I said hi." She felt herself slipping sideways on the couch. The room contracted to a point. She heard Sarah say her name once more, very clearly, in the voice of a woman who was going to have to live with this for a very long time. And then nothing. She came back to consciousness in a room made of cold iron. She knew she was somewhere entirely different before she opened her eyes. Because the smell was different. Not warm and ordinary and slightly cluttered with someone's real life. Cold, stone and metal and the flat. Characterless smell of a space designed to contain rather than inhabit. She opened her eyes. Stone walls, an iron table, two chairs, facing each other across it. A single overhead light that provided illumination rather than warmth. The kind of room that made its function obvious without explanation. She was in one of the chairs. Her jacket was gone. Her canvas bag was gone. Her phone was gone. The notebook was gone. In the chair across from her, Eleanor Sterling was already waiting. She was 60 years old, and she wore that age the way a title is worn, with full, deliberate display. Charcoal blazer, precisely fitted. Pearl earrings that caught the flat light without needing it. Silver hair cut to a precision that communicated intention in every line. Her posture was absolute. Her eyes were pale gray, nearly colorless. And they assessed Clara with the specific calm of a person accustomed to receiving reports rather than surprises. She said, "You're steadier than I would have expected from that dosage. Good. I prefer my conversations to be coherent." Clara said, "Where am I?" Eleanor said, "Somewhere appropriate." Clara said, "What do you want?" Eleanor said, "I want Dominic Medvance to make a particular and very specific mistake," Clara said. "And you believe I'm going to help you engineer it," Eleanor said. "I believe you're going to be the mechanism by which he makes it. Your cooperation is secondary to the outcome," Clara said. "I'm a nurse." "I don't have any connection to your war," Eleanor said. "You had no connection to it 2 weeks ago. The situation has developed since then." She said it without emotion, without satisfaction, without any of the theatrical pleasure that Clara might have expected. Eleanor Sterling, it appeared, was not a theatrical person. She was a woman who had been managing complex and dangerous operations for long enough that the drama of them had been entirely metabolized into the ordinary. Clara catalogued what she had. No phone, no supplies beyond what she was wearing, no obvious exit beyond the guarded door, an iron table, two chairs, a single light fixture, and something else. Through the wall to her right, a sound. She had heard it before she was consciously aware of hearing it. Because the specific acoustic signature of a mechanical ventilator was something 10 years in a trauma bay had installed in her perception the way a musician's ear installs intervals. The whoosh and beep cycle. The rhythm of a machine doing the work that a body should be doing on its own. And underneath it, at irregular intervals, a secondary alarm. She said, "Who is on the ventilator?" Eleanor went still in a way that was different from her usual stillness. Clara said, "The secondary alarm on a negative pressure ventilator sounds when the machine is compensating for inconsistent respiratory effort. It means the patient is not breathing reliably on their own. That pattern of alarm, irregular rather than consistent, suggests either neurological compromise or progressive muscle fatigue. Given the equipment I can hear, this person has been on that machine for a significant time." Eleanor said, "That is not your concern." Clara said, "Everything on a ventilator is my concern. It is constitutionally my concern." Eleanor said nothing. Clara said, "How long? Not since today. How long have they been on the machine?" A silence that lasted exactly long enough to tell Clara that Eleanor was considering how much to reveal. Eleanor said, 14 months of diagnosis. The ventilator for the past 5 weeks. Clara said, "Who is it?" Eleanor said, "My granddaughter. She is 8 years old." Something changed in the room. Not Eleanor's voice posture, not her expression, not any visible thing. But something changed. In the molecular quality of the air between them. Something that had to do with the word granddaughter and the specific pitch at which Eleanor had said it, which was the only thing Clara had heard from her that was not managed. Clara said, "What is her diagnosis?" Eleanor said, "Idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis, rare in pediatric patients. Aggressive progression." Clara said, "Is your doctor here in the compound?" Eleanor said, He has been here for the past 3 days, Clara said. Is he concerned? A pause. Eleanor said. Yes, Clara said. Let me see her, Eleanor said. You are here as leverage, not as a physician, Clara said. Your leverage has an expiration time attached to it that your doctor is apparently watching approach and feeling unable to stop. Let me see the child. I can assess in 15 minutes whether there's anything useful I can do. If there isn't, nothing has changed. If there is, we have something to discuss. Eleanor looked at her across the iron table. Clara held the look. She had looked at things more frightening than Eleanor Sterling's gray eyes across a trauma table. She had delivered news that no parent should have to hear, and she had done it while meeting every gaze directly. Because she believed that was what people deserved, Eleanor said. Her name is Lily. If you do anything that, Clara said. I have never harmed a patient in 10 years. I'm not going to start with an 8-year-old. A long silence. Eleanor stood. She led Clara out of the interrogation room and down a short corridor, and through a door into a room that had been converted into a medical suite with the particular quality of very expensive resources applied to a very desperate situation. The equipment was excellent. The ventilator was a top-tier model. The monitoring system was comprehensive. The IV lines were correctly placed. The room smelled of antiseptic and a faint floral fragrance, and underneath both the specific smell that Clara recognized from the long-term pediatric cases, the smell of a child's body working very hard for a very long time. Lily was small in the large bed. Red hair, the bright copper red of a child who would have freckles all her life. Even now, pale and exhausted and connected to 3 machines. The freckles were visible across her nose and cheeks. Her chest moved with the ventilator's rhythm. Each breath assisted. Each breath a mechanical gift. The doctor. A man in his early 50s who had the specific appearance of someone who had not slept adequately in several days. Looked at Clara with an expression she recognized immediately. The relief of someone who has been the only competent person in the room for too long and has just been joined by someone who might be equally competent. He said, I'm Dr. Palmer. She said, Clara Hayes. Show me everything. He showed her everything. She read standing up, rapidly, making marks on the margin of the chart with the pen she found in his jacket pocket. She asked him 6 specific clinical questions and listened to his answers with the attention she gave to everything, complete, analytical, seeking the gap between what had been done and what should have been done. Then she put the chart down and went to Lily's bedside. She performed a thorough assessment, systematic and careful, narrating quietly to Dr. Palmer as she worked. She listened to breath sounds with the stethoscope she found hanging on the bedside monitor. She checked the ventilator settings against what she was hearing in the chest. She assessed the numbers on the monitoring screen against each other and against her clinical understanding of the disease trajectory. At some point during the assessment, Lily's eyes opened. They were gray, like Eleanor's, but where Eleanor's gray was winter sky, Lily's was the gray of morning fog, the kind that burns off and becomes something else. They looked at Clara with the particular gaze of a child who has been frightened for a long time and who has learned to assess strangers quickly. Clara said, quietly, continuing her assessment without pause. Hi, my name is Clara. I'm just checking how you're doing. This won't hurt. Lily watched her. Clara finished the assessment. She stepped back. She turned to Eleanor, who had been standing in the doorway the entire time doing the thing that was, Clara suspected, the most difficult thing Eleanor Sterling had done in years. Standing somewhere she had no control and waiting. Clara said, the ventilator pressure support settings are too high for her current lung compliance. The over-distension has been causing fatigue in the left lower lobe, which is why the secondary alarm keeps sounding. Dr. Palmer has been compensating by increasing the respiratory rate, which makes the fatigue worse in a cycle that will continue to deteriorate. She said it directly to Eleanor. Medical information was for the patient's family, not primarily for the physician in the room, she said. I also need to reposition her. A 30-degree lateral tilt will improve perfusion to the right lung and take some of the work off the left. It's a simple change, but the effect is meaningful, she said. I can stabilize the acute situation tonight. I want to be transparent. I can't change the underlying diagnosis, and I can't replace specialist care. But I can stop the deterioration that's happening right now, and in exchange, I want to talk to you, Eleanor said. You're in no position to set terms. Clara said, I'm in the position of being the person in this room who can help Lily breathe more easily tonight. The rest of us are negotiating our positions. She's not negotiating anything. She's just a child on a ventilator who has been in this room for 5 weeks. She said it quietly and without performance. Eleanor looked at her granddaughter, then at Clara. She said, do what you can for her. We talk after. Clara went to work. She worked for 3 hours. She adjusted the ventilator settings first, walking Dr. Palmer through each change as she made it, explaining the reasoning in detail. She did this not because she needed the help, but because he needed to be able to maintain the corrections after she left. And a physician who understood the why behind a setting was significantly more reliable than one following a protocol without context. He was a good doctor, not out of his depth in an absolute sense, but operating in an area where he lacked the specialized pediatric experience to see what she was seeing. He took her instruction with the humility of someone who understood that ego had no useful function here. She repositioned Lily with the same careful narration, explaining what she was doing and why, at a level that Lily could follow without being frightened by it. The child did not speak, but she watched with those fog-gray eyes, and Clara could see her tracking the explanations, the intelligence behind the exhaustion. She reviewed the IV line medications, found one that was working against the respiratory goal in this specific case. A medication that made sense for a different clinical picture, but not for this one, and recommended to Dr. Palmer that it be tapered over the next 12 hours. He agreed immediately, which told her he had already had doubts about it. Then she monitored. She stood at Lily's bedside for 90 minutes, watching the numbers and watching the child breathe and making small adjustments as the picture settled into a new equilibrium. The secondary alarm stopped sounding after 40 minutes. The respiratory rate came down. The effort scores on the monitoring display improved by measurable degrees. Not dramatic, not miraculous. The child had a serious and progressive condition, and one evening's clinical work was not going to change the trajectory. But the acute deterioration stopped, and stopping it was what mattered tonight, at just after midnight. Clara stepped back from the bedside and assessed the full picture one more time. She said to Dr. Palmer, the settings need to be checked every 4 hours. The positioning should be maintained and reassessed after each check. She needs evaluation at a proper pediatric pulmonology center within the next 10 days. What I've done is management of an acute episode. She requires specialist-level care and, ideally, a transplant evaluation, Dr. Palmer said. Quietly, I know. Eleanor is resistant to the idea of moving her through official channels, Clara said. That is the conversation I'm about to have. She left the room and returned to the interrogation room, because it was the room she knew, and she sat in the chair she had occupied before. And she waited. Eleanor came 12 minutes later. She sat across from Clara and placed her hands on the iron table, and she was still wearing the pearl earrings and the precisely fitted jacket. But something around the edges of her had shifted in a way that was barely visible and entirely real. She looked like a woman who had just watched someone else do something she could not do herself, and who was adjusting to what that meant. Clara said, "Tell me about the shipping network." Eleanor looked at her. Clara said, "You're at war with Dominic Vance. I was in the compound for 9 days, and I'm a person who pays attention. The conflict is about operations, not about personal grievance. Operational conflicts have operational resolutions. Tell me what the actual issue is." Eleanor was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "My family built a shipping infrastructure over 20 years. before I took over the family operations, before Dominic Vance was old enough to run anything. My husband and I built roots that the organization ran on. When Dominic's father's people came into conflict with my husband, the network was taken. Dominic inherited the network along with everything else. He has been using it for 6 years. He may not even know its full history, Clara said. And you want it back. Eleanor said, I want the revenue it generates, or fair compensation for the infrastructure we built. What I have been offered, repeatedly, through intermediaries, has been neither. Clara said, That's a business dispute, Eleanor said. In my world, all disputes are ultimately business disputes. The violence is the negotiating mechanism when the business table doesn't produce results, Clara said. And what has the violence produced? Eleanor said. 3 years of expense and attrition, and no resolution, Clara said. Then the negotiating mechanism isn't working. Eleanor said nothing. Clara looked at her across the iron table. She said, Lily needs to be at a specialist center. She needs a transplant evaluation. She needs to be in the system, officially, where she has access to every available option. The condition she has progresses. What I stabilized tonight is not a long-term solution, Eleanor said. If she enters the official system, Clara said. I know, your family's activities become visible. There are people who might ask questions. Those are real risks, and I'm not dismissing them. But I need you to weigh them against the other risk, which is that she continues in her current trajectory without the intervention she needs. She said it directly. No softening, Eleanor said. You're telling me my family's security, or my granddaughter, Clara said. I'm telling you the situation as it is. The calculation is yours to make. Eleanor looked away. She looked at the wall to her right, which was the direction of the room where Lily was. Clara watched her face and saw, underneath the marble, the only thing that didn't have a strategic layer, Clara said. I will provide you with a proper care regimen. I know a pediatric respiratory specialist I can contact discreetly, without involving your family's name. I can get the right guidance on Lily's ongoing management and on the transplant evaluation pathway. I will do this genuinely, not as leverage, because she is a child and she needs it, she said, in exchange. You end any targeting of me or anyone connected to me. You release me tonight. And you and Dominic find a different table for your business dispute, Eleanor said. You're negotiating for Dominic Vance, Clara said. I'm negotiating for myself. The consequences for Dominic are secondary, Eleanor said. And if I refuse, Clara said, then Dominic continues looking for me, which he has been doing since the day after I arrived at his compound. His intelligence resources are considerable. He will eventually locate this compound. When that happens, this room, this situation, and Lily's medical management all become considerably more uncertain. She stated it the way she stated clinical facts, plainly, without embellishment, without any personal investment in the response. Eleanor was quiet for a long time. Clara waited. She was accustomed to waiting in difficult rooms with difficult people who needed time to arrive at conclusions she had already reached. She had delivered diagnoses and prognoses and end-of-life options, and she had sat in those rooms through silences that felt geological. This was another room, another silence, a different kind of impossible calculus, Eleanor said. Your word. As a nurse, Clara said. Yes, Eleanor said. Why should that mean anything? Clara said. Because in 10 years of practice, I have never told a patient something I didn't believe to be true. I have never made a promise about care that I didn't keep. I've made mistakes. Clinical ones, the kind that haunt you and that you learn from. But I have never deceived a patient or a patient's family about what I was going to do. That's the only record I can offer you, Eleanor said. That is a different currency from the one I operate in, Clara said. I know, but it's what I have. Another silence. Eleanor reached a decision in the way that Clara was beginning to understand. Eleanor Sterling made all decisions, quietly, completely, without announcement. She said, I agree to your terms. She stood and crossed to the door and spoke briefly to someone outside. A moment later, a phone was brought in, small, prepaid, the kind purchased in cash and not connected to anything trackable. Clara dialed the number she had memorized on her 4th day in the compound. Because she had memorized it the way she memorized everything important, by writing it in her mind in the same small, neat script she used on charts. It rang twice. Dominic's voice was controlled and absolutely alert, and she understood from the quality of it that he had not been sleeping. He said, "Where are you?" She said, "Sterling compound." "I'm not hurt." "Stand down from whatever you're planning." A silence. "Stand down." Clara said, "Yes, I've negotiated terms. Come to the east entrance. Come in one vehicle. Come in an hour," he said, very carefully. "Are you actually unharmed?" She said, "Completely. But we need to talk in person." East entrance. 1 hour, she hung up. She looked at Eleanor. She said, "He'll come." Eleanor said, "I know he'll come." "That was the plan," Clara said. "That was your plan. My plan is different." "He's coming to negotiate," Eleanor said. "He's coming because he thinks you need rescuing," Clara said. "He can think whatever he wants on the drive over. When he arrives, I'll manage the conversation." Eleanor looked at her with the first expression Clara had seen from her that approached something like humor, though it was a very dry, very brief variety of it. She said, "You're a considerable thing to have stumbled into this situation," Clara said. "I was placed into it deliberately, by people on multiple sides. I'm just trying to find the line through." She stood up and stretched, feeling the ache of having sat on an iron chair for the better part of 2 hours after a night of clinical work on a concrete floor. She said, "I'd like to look in on Lily before the meeting," Eleanor said. "Of course." She meant it. That was interesting, too. The East Gate meeting happened at 1 in the morning in the particular cold of a city that had finished its ordinary business and was in the thin hours before it started again. Dominic arrived exactly when Clara had told him to arrive, with 2 vehicles and 4 men, which was fewer than Eleanor had inside the compound, but not fewer in any meaningful tactical sense. Eleanor came to the gate herself, which Clara recognized as deliberate, showing up in person, without a representative or a buffer, was the version of a gesture that someone like Eleanor Sterling was capable of making when she had decided to make a gesture. Clara stood between them in the cold courtyard air. She had borrowed a clean shirt from a supply closet in the compound's laundry, slightly too large, which she wore with the sleeves rolled up, because this was how she worked, and it felt important to wear that signal. She had eaten something from Eleanor's kitchen at Eleanor's quiet instruction, because the night ahead would require her to be functional, and she was already low on resources. She had spent 20 minutes in Lily's room before coming to the gate, confirming that the adjustments were holding and briefing Dr. Palmer once more on the key indicators to watch through the night. She began speaking before either of them had a chance to speak to each other. She said, "Here is where we are. Eleanor has agreed to terminate any further targeting of me or of anyone in my personal life. Specifically, Sarah Jenkins and her children are off limits. In exchange, I provide ongoing care coordination for her granddaughter, Lily, who has idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis and needs specialist-level management." She said, "Dominic, I am asking you to agree to a 90-day cessation of active aggression against Sterling operations. 90 days in which both parties can engage in a negotiated settlement of the shipping network dispute through legitimate channels," Dominic said. "I haven't agreed to that," Clara said. "No, I'm asking you to now." He looked at her. She said, "You have been at war for 3 years. From what I observed in 9 days in your compound, this conflict has cost you significant resources and at least 6 personnel. I heard enough through open doors to understand that the shipping network is a revenue source, not an irreplaceable one. And I know enough about how you think to understand that you have been considering a strategic shift toward legitimate operations for longer than you've told anyone." A silence, he said. What else did you hear through open doors? She said, enough. Do you agree to the 90 days? He looked at Eleanor. Eleanor looked back at him. It was the first time they had looked directly at each other, in what Clara suspected was years. It had the quality of a silence that was actually a great deal of unsaid information being exchanged at high speed. He said, 90 days. With the condition that I retain access to current intelligence on Sterling operations. Not aggressive collection. Monitoring, Eleanor said. Matched condition. I retain the same access on your operations. He said. Agreed. Eleanor said. Agreed, Clara said. Good, she breathed out slowly. She thought, briefly. I just ended a 3-year mafia war using a child's ventilator settings and the negotiating framework of a 34-year-old ER nurse with no political training and a canvas bag of medical supplies. She let herself think that exactly once and then she put it away. On the drive back to the compound, Dominic was quiet for 8 miles. He said, You used Eleanor Sterling's dying granddaughter as a negotiating mechanism, Clara said. I destabilized a seriously ill child and then engaged Eleanor in a conversation about mutual interest. The child was not a mechanism. She was a patient, he said. The line between those two things was very fine, she said. I know exactly where the line is. I was on the right side of it, he said. I believe you, she said. Good, he said. Martinez's blood pressure is down. He told me yesterday, she said. Is he taking the medication twice a day? He said. He told me the nurse gave orders, and he wasn't going to argue with the nurse, she said. Sensible man. A brief silence. Different from the previous one, he said. Your father is in a safe house 3 miles from here. My people found him 4 days ago. He's been trying to get information about you. She said nothing for a moment. She said, Is he? He said, physically fine. Emotionally, he is carrying something very heavy, she said. He's been carrying something very heavy for 20 years, he said. This time seems different. She said, You don't know him. He said, No. But I know what it looks like when someone has run out of the particular form of denial that they've been using as infrastructure. She looked at him. He was watching the road, but she could see his profile. And it had the quality it sometimes had when he was saying something that was not entirely tactical. She said, What happened to your brother? The road moved under them for a moment. He said his name was Daniel. He was 17. He had appendicitis that became peritonitis because we couldn't afford the initial visit, and by the time someone saw him, it had progressed. The hospital did what it could. It wasn't enough. He said, I was 23. I had nothing. I had a mother who was working 2 jobs and still couldn't make the cost work. And a brother who was 17 and who died from something that had a 99% survival rate if treated within the first 24 hours, he said. I built everything I have because I decided I was never going to be that powerless again. Clara was quiet for a moment. She said, I understand that impulse completely, he said. But, she said, but powerlessness that becomes power that becomes control of other people is a different problem, not a solution to the original one, he said. The Healthcare Foundation, she said. Tell me about it, he said. It's not fully formed. The concept is that the revenue from my legitimate operations funds a community health foundation, clinics, in neighborhoods like the one Daniel grew up in. She said, That's not altruism. He said, No, she said. But it's something worth building, he said. I'm working on how to make it real. She said, Keep working. The compound came into view ahead, its lights warm in the cold night. Clara looked at those lights and felt the particular dangerous warmth of something that was beginning to feel like resolution. A truce agreed to. A child's breathing stabilized. A conversation happening in a car at 2 in the morning that was about something real rather than strategic. She allowed it. Just for the drive. Just for the remaining minutes of darkness and cold air and the city moving past. Dominic opened the car door when they stopped. She stepped out. She looked up at the building in the night air, breathing, and she almost didn't catch it. Almost the laser sight was a pinpoint of red light, barely visible against the dark surface of the car door. She saw it because she was looking in that direction, and because her visual field had been trained for 10 years to notice things that were slightly wrong. It was painted on Dominic's chest, she said. Down. She was already moving as she said it. Her hands hit his upper arm and his shoulder, and the momentum carried them both sideways behind the rear of the car as the shot hit the door with a metallic crack 4 inches to the left of where he'd been standing. Then more shots. In rapid sequence, from different angles. Dominic had a weapon in his hand. She had not seen it drawn. His voice was completely controlled. He said, "Stay behind the car," she said. "Eleanor," he said, "look at the angle of the shots." She looked. West, Eleanor's compound was north, he said, quietly. Into his earpiece. "Taking fire. East entrance perimeter. Lockdown," she said. "Who?" he said. "Eleanor has a lieutenant, Victor Cross. He's been with her for 12 years. He wants both operations and has decided now is the moment," she said. Eleanor agreed to the truce. She agreed. He said. Eleanor agreed. Cross is not currently operating under Eleanor's authority. He's been building this separately for months. Eleanor didn't know. Clara pressed herself against the rear wheel and breathed in the deliberate, controlled way that she had learned for the situations where breathing was what you had to do when everything else was not possible. She was unarmed. The compound entrance was 40 yards of open ground. Cross's people were firing from at least 3 positions. She said, "What do we do?" He said in 15 seconds. "On my signal. You run for the door. Straight line. Don't stop," she said. "And you," he said, "right behind you." She said, "If you're not," he said. "Clara," she said, "if you're not right behind me, I'm going to come back, so you should be right behind me." Something moved in his face in the dark behind the car. He said, "Go." She ran. The 40 yards felt like a different unit of measurement altogether. She was aware of shots. Aware of the sound of return fire from Dominic's people. Aware of her own breathing and the cold ground under her feet and the door ahead. It opened as she reached it, pulled from inside by someone who had been watching. And she went through and caught herself against the interior wall. Dominic was through 2 seconds behind her. The door locked. Clara stood with her back against the wall and felt her heartbeat at approximately 140 beats per minute, which she assessed clinically and with a certain dark amusement. And then she breathed it down, in and out, in and out. Dominic was already on his earpiece again, moving toward the security hub. And the compound had shifted around them into the particular focused energy of people executing emergency protocols. Quieter than she would have expected. More deliberate. She stood in the corridor and took stock. The truce had lasted 2 hours and approximately 40 minutes. Victor Cross had not been building this over weeks. This had the structure of something that had been planned for months, with timing contingent on an opportunity. The opportunity, she realized with a cold clarity, had been the truce. A moment when both principals were in the same location, in close proximity, engaged in something that required their attention. She had created the opportunity by engineering the truce. She stood with that for a moment. Then she went to find Dominic, because whatever came next, she was going to be useful in it. The assault on the compound started at 11:27 that evening. Victor Cross had 12 years of Eleanor Sterling's operational knowledge. He knew the compound's layout. He knew the patrol patterns and the camera placements and the secondary exits. He had resources that had been quietly separated from Sterling operations over the course of those months of preparation. And he had the particular advantage of someone whose opponent doesn't know they're an opponent until the moment of action. He used all of it. The first explosion hit the east perimeter wall at exactly 11:27. It was large enough to shake the building to its core, to send plaster dust raining from the second-floor ceilings, to set off every alarm simultaneously in a wall of sound that was disorienting by design. The second explosion came 90 seconds later and took the main gate. That one was specifically designed to disable vehicle egress. Clara knew this because she understood now. with the clarity of someone who had been paying attention for 9 days. How, this man thought. She was in her room when the first explosion hit, and she was on the floor before the sound fully registered. Because she was a trauma nurse, and the first lesson of chaos was that a floor was safer than a standing position. She grabbed her canvas bag, which she had repacked the night before with fresh supplies from the clinic, and she moved into the corridor. The corridor was controlled chaos. People moving with purpose in multiple directions. All of them executing specific assignments that told Clara this was a scenario they had trained for. She moved with them rather than against them, calculating the geometry of the building and where she needed to be. Dominic found her 2 minutes later. He was moving fast, wearing body armor over his shirt, and the 4 people with him were similarly equipped and clearly had very specific places to be. One of them had blood on his face from a facial laceration that Clara could see from 10 feet away was deep enough to need suturing. She stopped the bleeding man with a hand on his arm. He looked at Dominic. Dominic said, "Do exactly what she says." Clara had the laceration field dressed in 90 seconds. Not correct suturing. Not in a moving corridor, but clean and compressed and sufficient. She stood up. She said to Dominic, "Where are we going?" He said, "Underground. There's a secondary extraction route. Corridor under the east wing. South exit. We move now." They moved. The underground corridor was concrete, narrower than the upstairs passages, lit in emergency red from battery backup systems. Clara moved through it with the group and heard the firefight through the concrete above them, distributed and intense. And she kept her assessment of the sounds clinical, multiple positions, sustained rather than overwhelming. Cross's forces were engaged but had not overrun the perimeter. They came out into a garage on the south side, 2 armored vehicles, engines running. Dominic said, "You're in the second vehicle," Clara said. "Where are you?" He said first. She said, "I should be with you." "If there are injuries," he said, "there won't be. You'll be safer in the second vehicle. Go," she went. Not because she agreed with the assessment, but because this was not the moment for the argument. And she could make her case from the second vehicle if she needed to. They moved out through the South Service Road. The road was dark, and the city around them was doing its ordinary things. Indifferent. For 6 blocks, she thought. We're clear. 6 blocks of thinking they were clear. Then the RPG hit. It struck the road directly in front of the lead vehicle, and the explosion was a force rather than a sound first. A pressure wave that she felt even through the armored door of the second car. A physical fact rather than an auditory one. The lead vehicle went sideways. Not destroyed, flipped, one door blown open, coming to rest on its side against a concrete divider. The driver of her vehicle was already reacting, braking, turning right onto a cross street. She said, "Stop the car." The driver said, "Miss Hayes, we have orders to." She said, "Stop the car right now. The lead vehicle may have casualties." The driver said, "Miss Hayes," she said, "Stop." She had her hand on the door handle. The driver stopped. She went. She went at a run, and the man who tried to stop her was half a step behind, and she was already 20 yards down the street toward the flipped vehicle before he caught up. And she had her medical bag open as she ran. Hands finding the items she'd need by position without looking. Because she had organized that bag the way she organized everything she needed in the dark. The lead vehicle was on its side. The door that had blown was facing upward, open, through it. She could see Dominic pulling himself up with the controlled deliberateness of a man who was managing something and not showing it. He emerged through the door and dropped to the ground. He was upright. He was moving. She reached him. He looked at her, with the expression she would later remember as profound exhaustion, combined with something that might have been exasperation if he'd had the energy for it. He said, "I specifically said the second vehicle," she said. "You were in a flipped car," he said. "I've had worse situations," she said. "That doesn't seem true." "Hold still. Let me look at your arm." His forearm had a significant cut from the shattered door. She wrapped it with efficiency she had arrived at through sheer repetition. 4 layers in 30 seconds. Compression adequate. She scanned the rest of him as she worked. Face clear. Gait functional. Holding left side but not acutely. Managing pain with the specific discipline she had learned to recognize as his particular courage. Around them, the street had become the kind of situation she had only ever encountered in films. Cross's forces moving in from east and west. Dominic's team returning fire from cover. The sound and light of it all in a 50-yard stretch of city street that had been ordinary 10 minutes ago. She heard her name, not called, said, from somewhere to the east, in the direction of an alley. Said in a voice that she would have recognized at any volume and from any distance. The voice that had been the constant acoustic backdrop of her entire childhood. Worn and familiar, and completely breaking in a way it had never broken before. Arthur Hayes came out of the alley. He was wearing the same coat he'd worn for 5 years. He was moving with the determined, slightly unsteady urgency of a man who had been moving for a long time on very little sleep, and the kind of motivation that comes from being desperate enough to be brave. He was 58 years old, and he looked it. And he looked something else, too. Something Clara had not seen on his face in longer than she could precisely remember. He was clear. She said, "Dad." He stopped when he heard her voice. He found her in the chaos of the street, his face when it found hers. Went through something she could not fully interpret. Something too layered and too fast for a single word. And then it settled into the clear expression she had noticed. He said, "I've been following them. Since I understood what was happening to you, I have people I know, people from the old days, who still owe me. I tracked the Sterling network. I tracked Cross's separate operation. I followed the intelligence until I knew where they were pushing you tonight," he said. "I've been trying to find a way to help for 9 days. I kept losing you. One of Cross's soldiers had spotted him, was turning. 2 more, nearby. Adjusting their positions toward the new variable." Arthur held up both hands. In his left hand was a device that could have been many things. In his right hand, held open and visible, was a lighter. He said, loudly, clearly, "There is a gas main under this block. I found the junction point about 25 minutes ago. I used to work construction. I know where the mains run in buildings this age." One of the soldiers said, "He's bluffing." Arthur smiled. It was the smile Clara had not seen since she was 8 years old. The smile from before the drinking took everything. The wide and slightly reckless smile of a man who had spent his entire adult life gambling and who had, in this single moment, found the hand he had been born to play. He said, "Maybe. Want to find out." Then he looked at Clara. One look, direct and completely clear. All the apologies that 20 years had accumulated and never been adequately expressed. All the love that the addiction had distorted but never extinguished. And something that had no name because it was too specific to him, to this moment, to this last calculation. He said, "Clara, go," she said. "Dad," he said. "Right now." "Go." Dominic's hand was on her arm. She said, "No," Dominic said, very quietly, right next to her ear. "He has already decided. He's already done the math," she said. "I can," he said. "He decided before he walked out of that alley. You know that." The soldiers were still calculating, still uncertain about the lighter and the device, and the 58-year-old man, who was standing very still and smiling. The calculation cost them 8 seconds. Arthur Hayes had gambled his entire life. He had lost most of those bets. He had lost money and time and relationships, and the ability to look his daughter in the eyes without flinching. He had, in the account of his life, far more losses than wins. He had been saving this one. He dropped the lighter. The explosion was not from a gas main. He had found a fuel storage unit in the basement of the building behind him and had spent 20 minutes arranging the access. It was smaller than what he had implied, but it was enough. The blast cleared the soldiers from the immediate area, threw them off their tactical footing, brought a section of the alley wall down across the junction where he had been standing. Clara heard herself make a sound. She did not know what kind of sound until later, when Dominic told her, because she had no conscious record of making it. She was aware of fire and debris and Dominic's arm around her and the world being very loud and then, in a particular way, very quiet. And then she was moving, because Dominic was moving her. Because his arm was inexorable, and he was saying her name and the word now, and her body was doing what it was told while her mind stayed behind at the junction point where her father had been standing. She got into the second vehicle. Dominic got in beside her. The driver went. Clara pressed both hands flat on her thighs. The fabric of her trousers was rough under her palms. She pressed harder and felt that roughness and breathed in a completely deliberate, completely controlled way. In for 4 counts. Hold for 2. Out for 6. The rhythm she used in the ER when the situation was bad and she needed to stay functional. She did not think about the alley wall. She thought about what she needed to do next. She thought about Dominic, who was managing something. She could feel it in the way he was holding his right side. She said, "How long?" He said, "What?" She said, "How long have you been bleeding internally?" He said, "You can't," she said, "right side. Guarding it since before the explosion. The arm is the visible injury, but the arm is fine. You took impact trauma to the abdomen. The vest stopped penetration but not force transfer." He said nothing. She said, "How long?" He said, "Since the initial explosion. When the vehicle went over." She said, "We need a location now. Not a hospital. Somewhere I can work," he said into his earpiece. "South Waterfront Warehouse. Code 7, he said to her. 10 minutes, she said. "Tell me about the damage." He said, "I don't know exactly." She said, "What does it feel like?" He described it. She listened. She built her clinical picture from the description with the same process she used when a patient arrived unable to be examined. Inference from reported sensation. Cross-referenced against mechanism of injury. Against presentation. Against what she knew about physics and the body's response to blunt force trauma to the upper right quadrant. She said, "Liver. Probably a laceration. Could be a contusion with internal bleeding. Could be both." He said, "Prognosis." She said, "Depends on the rate. If it's tamponating, we have time. If it's not," she said, "I need to work." He said, "You'll have what you need." She said, "I'll have what I brought. Which is going to have to be enough." She pressed her hands on her thighs again. Felt the fabric. Breathed, she thought. One thing at a time, she thought. First Dominic. First the work. She let herself think about the alley for exactly 3 seconds. Then she closed the door on it. She was Clara Hayes. She had work to do. The warehouse was the kind of building that had no aspirations. Large, utilitarian. Built in the era when the South Waterfront was purely industrial, and no one had yet decided that industrial spaces could be made beautiful. Iron gray walls. A loading bay on the north side. An interior that was large and high-ceilinged and lit. When the driver entered the code and the lights came on, by a single bank of industrial fluorescence that illuminated everything in the flat. Merciless way of spaces designed for function rather than occupation. They were 7 people: Clara, Dominic, the driver, and 4 others who had been in the second vehicle and who moved through the warehouse with the trained efficiency of people who had used this space before. Clara registered all of them and registered also, with the peripheral part of her attention that she kept for the room rather than the immediate task, the exits. A freight door on the north, a personnel door on the east, and what appeared to be a set of offices along the south wall with interior windows that faced the main floor. She was focused on Dominic. She moved him to the clearest area of floor, near the south offices, and made him sit with his back against the wall. He sat with the controlled reluctance of someone who was complying because compliance was, in this case, the logical choice and not because he liked it. She put her bag down beside him and began her assessment. He was pale, not catastrophically, not in the way that meant the crisis was already irreversible, but pale in the specific way that meant blood was going somewhere it shouldn't be going, and the body was working to compensate. She said, "Show me." He unbuttoned his shirt without comment. She looked at what was underneath, and her clinical mind moved through what she was seeing with the speed of someone who had seen a great many bodies in a great many states. The vest had done its job against penetration. The impact had done something else. The bruising pattern on his right upper abdomen was significant, deep purple, already spreading, accompanied by the kind of muscle rigidity that told her the body was guarding something real. She pressed carefully around the area, systematic, starting from the periphery and moving in, watching his face as she did. He didn't make a sound. He didn't move. She said, "Here." She pressed gently on a specific point. His jaw tightened slightly. She said, "And here." Another point. The same. She stood back. She said, "Hepatic laceration." "The liver." "Your blood pressure is dropping, but not in the catastrophic range, which means you may be tamponating, which is when the bleeding is self-limiting. Because of the pressure within the capsule, that's the good scenario." He said, "And the other scenario?" She said, "The bleed is active and continuing, and we have approximately 3 to 4 hours before the situation becomes critical." He said, "So we operate." She said, "You need a surgeon." "I'm a nurse with a field kit," he said. "What can you do with a field kit?" She said, "I can manage the tamponade. I can monitor. I can buy you time. I cannot perform the surgery you need." He said, "Then manage and monitor." She said, "I'm already doing that." She worked with what she had. She established the best IV access she could with the materials available. She positioned him to minimize pressure on the injury. She took his blood pressure every 15 minutes with the cuff from her bag. And she logged the numbers in her notebook with the date and the time and the clinical notes. Because when a proper physician eventually saw him, that record would matter. She set her flashlight at an angle that gave her the best visibility. She assembled the suture kit, not because she could do what needed doing with it, but because having it accessible was appropriate. She inventoried everything she had and made calculations about how long each resource would last at the current rate of use. She was 20 minutes into it when Dominic said, "You should go." She did not look up from what she was doing. She said, "I know you have thoughts about that. Give me 30 seconds." He waited. She completed the blood pressure check. She recorded the number. The number was lower than the previous one, but not dramatically lower. The rate of decline told her something. She looked at him. He said, "Cross has the building surrounded. He'll breach within the hour. When he does, go to them. Tell them you were being held against your will. Cross wants leverage. He has no interest in killing a civilian," she said. "And what does Cross want to do with you?" He said, "Whatever gives him maximum negotiating position with the remaining Vance operations." She said, "So he needs you alive." He said, "For now." She said, "Then I'll stay." He said, "Clara." She said, "He killed my father." He said nothing. She said, "Cross, or Cross's orders, or the confusion that Cross created. My father is dead. I am not going to cooperate with Victor Cross." He said, "You're making an emotional decision." She said, "I'm making the only decision available to me that I can live with." "Those aren't always different things." He said, "If they breach." She said, "If they breach. I'll assess the situation and make the best available decision. That is what I always do." He said, "Clara," she said, "there's a vault in the back office. Tell me the combination." He looked at her for a moment. He said, "You can't be in the main space when they come through." She said, "I know." He said the combination, a date, the month and day and year of Daniel's birthday, which she found she could not think about directly right now, without it becoming too much. So she wrote it in her mind as numbers only, and locked them there. He said, "Promise me you'll go to the vault when they breach." She said, "I promise I'll go to the vault." She said it because it was true. He said, "Thank you." She went back to monitoring. At 2:15 in the morning, the warehouse stores came in, both simultaneously, east and north, breaching charges that were precise and loud and efficient. Cross's men were inside the space in under 10 seconds. She counted 14. Armed, positioned, moving with the kind of coordinated clarity that 12 years of Eleanor Sterling's operational training produced. Dominic said, "Go." She looked at him. She picked up her medical bag. She had packed it without thinking about it. Her hands knowing before her mind did that she was taking it with her. She walked to the back office. She found the vault. She entered the combination. The door opened inward onto a small, cold space that smelled of metal and aged paper. Completely dark until she turned her phone's light on. And she went in. She stood inside the vault. She could hear. Through the steel door, and through the concrete of the warehouse interior, sounds from the main floor. A voice she didn't know. Commanding. Dominic's voice. Controlled even now. The sounds of people being moved. Positioned. She pressed both hands against the inside of the vault door. She listened. Victor Cross had a voice like someone who had waited a very long time for something and was now experiencing the particular quality of impatience that comes with finally having it, but not yet having it completely. He wanted Dominic's cooperation. He wanted the codes and the contacts and the structural keys of the Vance operation. He wanted the submission, not just the compliance. And Dominic, she could hear even through the door, was giving him nothing. She stood in the dark. She stood there for 35 seconds. Then she said, very quietly, to no one, "You are a trauma nurse. You do not walk away from a code blue." She turned her phone light to the upper corner of the vault. The ventilation grate was 10 inches by 12 inches. It was attached with 4 screws that appeared to not have been tightened in a significant period of time. She looked at her hands. She thought about the 19-year-old with the wrongly set finger who had not cried. She thought about Martinez, who was taking his blood pressure medication twice a day because the nurse had told him to. She thought about Daniel, who was 17, who had died from appendicitis because the system had failed him. She thought about Lily, who was 8 and who liked horses, and who was angry that she couldn't ride them, and who was breathing more easily tonight because someone had been present enough and stubborn enough to help. She gripped the ventilation grate. She pulled. The screws came out slowly, then not slowly. She used both hands and the leverage of her entire body weight, and the grate came free, and the edges of it were sharp. And when she registered the pain in her palms, she registered it as information and set it aside. She looked at the shaft. She climbed in. It was barely enough space. She moved on her elbows and her knees on the metal surface, which was cold enough to feel through her clothing, and she followed the duct to the right, which was the direction that felt correct in her spatial map of the building. And she counted the distance in seconds and in arm lengths, and she emerged. After 2 minutes of movement that she was not going to describe accurately to anyone later, because the accuracy would be too undignified. Through a ceiling panel in the east interior office, she dropped to the floor. 4 feet. She landed quietly, because she had experience with controlled drops from the 2 times in residency she had needed to haul herself over a railing to reach a patient faster. And she kept her knees soft and her weight distributed. And it was fine. She stood up. She looked through the interior window of the office. Dominic was on the floor of the main warehouse space, 20 feet away, sitting back against a structural column, hands behind him. Cross's men were around him in a configuration that communicated control. Cross himself was standing in front of him, speaking in the low, precise way of someone who had specific things they wanted and was being methodical about obtaining them. Dominic's face was the face she had come to know, controlled, entirely present, giving nothing. His color was bad. She could see that from 20 feet through a dirty interior window. The internal bleeding was continuing. She looked at the floor of the office. Steel pipe. Too short. A wooden chair. Too unwieldy. A stack of folders. A power strip. She picked up her medical bag. She thought, what I have is what I am. She opened the office door and walked out onto the main floor. 14 armed men became aware of her simultaneously. The awareness moved through the room like a current. Cross turned around. Victor Cross was 45 years old and had the face of someone who'd been strategic for so long that strategy had replaced expression. He assessed her in a single second, non-threatening, unarmed, clearly out of place. He said, "Who are you?" She said, "I'm a nurse." "And that man needs medical attention immediately." Cross said, "He's fine." She said, "He has internal abdominal bleeding that has been progressing for 2 hours. He is not fine. He is alive because he is extremely physically resilient and because I have been monitoring him. He will continue to be alive only if the hemorrhage is properly managed." She said, "You need him alive. I heard you from across the room. You want his codes, his contacts, the keys to his operation. You cannot get those from a dead man." Cross said, "He can tell me what I need now." She said, "He can barely maintain consciousness. The information he gives you in his current state, you will not be able to rely on. You need him stable, alert, and functional. I can give you that. But I need to work on him right now." Cross studied her. He was a man who made calculations. He had been making calculations for 12 years in Eleanor Sterling's operation, and he understood the value of leverage and the cost of killing leverage prematurely. He said, "You have 25 minutes." She said, 30. He said, 25. She said, "Fine. Tell your people to give me space." She crossed the warehouse floor. She knelt beside Dominic and opened her bag. He looked at her. He was pale and his blood pressure, which she checked immediately, was lower than she wanted. He was looking at her with an expression that, in the flat industrial light, was the least managed expression she had seen from him. There was nothing strategic in it. She said, "I went into the vault." He said, "I know." She said, "I didn't promise to stay in it." Something crossed his face. If it had been a different moment, if there had been no internal bleeding and no 14 armed men and no Cross standing 10 feet away, it might have been a laugh. She said, "This is going to hurt. Do not move." She worked. She worked the way she worked in the trauma bay at 3 in the morning when the situation was bad and the resources were limited, and the only thing that was going to make a difference was the refusal to stop doing what she knew how to do. She managed the abdominal pressure. She reestablished her IV access. She monitored his vitals with the disciplined attention of someone for whom every number told a story and every story had implications. She was 18 minutes into it when she heard the far warehouse door open, not the breech doors. The primary freight door on the north wall, which opened from the outside with a code that Cross apparently did not know was no longer exclusively his. Eleanor Sterling walked in. She walked in the way she always moved, with the absolute certainty of someone who has decided what they are going to do and considers the room's opinion of this irrelevant. She had 8 people with her. They were positioned with the precision of a force that had planned its entry carefully. Cross said, "Eleanor." Eleanor said, "Victor." She said his name in the way a person says the name of a problem they have been vain to gain properly recognized for too long. Cross said, "You're late." Eleanor said, "Am I?" She looked at Clara, who was on the concrete floor with blood on her palms from the ventilation grate and a blood pressure cuff in her hand, and an expression of absolute concentrated focus that had no room in it for anything besides the work. She looked at Dominic, who was alive. She said, "It appears not." Cross said, "Eleanor, this is the right move. They're both weak. We take both operations now and consolidate." "That's what you've always wanted," Eleanor said. "I have wanted a great many things over a great many years. I have not always wanted them in the way you seem to have believed I wanted them," Cross said. "The window is," Eleanor said. "Victor, you separated $2 million from my operating funds over 14 months to build this. You used 6 of my people without my knowledge. You executed 3 operations in my name that I did not authorize," she said. "And you killed an older man who was on that street to help his daughter." Clara's hands went still for a moment. Eleanor said, "That is not something I do. That is not something this family does. That line is not negotiable. It has never been negotiable. She said it without particular heat. She said it as one states a position that is so fundamental that it no longer requires defense. Only statement. Cross said. Eleanor, you need to. Eleanor said. Victor. She said his name once more, very quietly. Her people moved. It was over quickly. Clara kept her eyes on Dominic's blood pressure, reading, and his pulse, and the clinical picture in front of her. And she breathed. And she did the work that was hers to do, while the sounds of the room resolved into a new arrangement. When the warehouse was quiet, she was still on the floor. Eleanor crossed to her. She crouched down, which was not a natural movement for her posture, but which she did without hesitation. And she looked at what Clara was doing with an attention that was, Clara thought, the same attention she probably gave to everything in her world. She said, quietly, "How is he?" Clara said, "He needs surgery. He needed it 2 hours ago." "I've been buying time," Eleanor said. "I have a team. They can be here in 20 minutes." Clara said, "Get them here." Eleanor stood. She made a call. She stood to the side. Clara looked at Dominic. He was looking back at her. His eyes were present. Focused, the dark, attentive quality of them, unchanged even in the flat industrial light. He was looking at her the way he had looked at her since the beginning, comprehensively, assessingly, with the full attention of a person who was always paying attention. She said, "You climbed through a ventilation shaft." She said, "I did." He said, "You promised to go to the vault." She said, "I did go to the vault. I went in. I assessed the situation. Then I came back out." She said it with the specific tone of a person who has honored the letter of their promise and is not sorry about it. He said, "Clara," she said, "save the rest of it. Tell me when you're not bleeding internally." He said, "All right," she said. "All right." She took his pulse and recorded it. She checked the IV line. She said to Eleanor, "Across the warehouse. He needs to be kept warm. Something for the floor temperature." Eleanor had a blanket delivered from somewhere in under 4 minutes, which told Clara something about how Eleanor's operations worked. Clara tucked the blanket around Dominic with the matter-of-fact care of someone who has done this for 1,000 patients and who does not make a performance of it. He said very quietly, "Your father," she said. "I know." He said, She said, "I know what he did. I know everything he did. Both things." She pressed 2 fingers against his wrist and counted. She said, "Your pulse is 88. That's better than 20 minutes ago." He said, "You're going to count my pulse instead of having this conversation," she said. "I'm going to count your pulse because your pulse is clinical information. The conversation can wait." He was quiet. She kept his wrist in her hand and she counted. And she breathed. And the warehouse was quiet around them, except for Eleanor's people, and the distant sounds of a city doing its ordinary things. The medical team arrived in 18 minutes. They were efficient, discreet, equipped with the particular quality of professionals who worked in circumstances where discretion was part of the service. They assessed. They loaded. They moved. Clara got into the transport vehicle with Dominic, because she was not the kind of person who stood on the pavement and watched a patient be taken somewhere without her. Eleanor didn't argue with that. Possibly she had already understood it wasn't worth arguing about. The surgery took 4 hours and 22 minutes. Clara waited in a private room in a facility that existed in the gray margin between official medicine and the situations that official medicine couldn't accommodate. She had been in rooms like this once before, briefly during residency, and she disapproved of their existence on principle and was deeply grateful for this specific one. She drank bad coffee. She sat in a plastic chair. She thought. She thought about Arthur Hayes at 35 years old, when she was 8, sitting at the kitchen table on a Saturday morning, teaching her the rules of probability with a worn deck of cards. She had been fascinated. She had believed that if you understood the odds clearly enough, you could always make the right choice. He had laughed and told her the odds were just suggestions. She had thought he was wrong. She had spent the next 26 years slowly understanding that he was more right than she had wanted to admit. She thought about him walking out of the alley. She thought about his eyes. She thought about the specific clarity of his face in that last moment. The clarity that had nothing to do with the choices he had made and everything to do with the choice he was making, she thought. He was afraid, she thought. He was afraid and he walked out anyway. She thought about the 20 years of gambling and the bottles and the bills on her kitchen table and the photographs in the manila folder and the voicemails she had listened to, with the particular resignation of someone who had stopped expecting them to mean what they implied, she thought. He was more than the worst things he did. He was also the Saturday morning card games, and the laugh she had inherited the shape of, and the moment in the street where he had stood very still and smiled. She could hold all of those things at once. She was still deciding what they added up to. The surgeon came out at 6:35 in the morning. He was a small, precise man with the manner of someone who worked in compressed circumstances and had long since stopped being interested in the circumstances and only in the work. He said stable. The hepatic laceration was manageable, grade 2. Controlled hemorrhage. He'll need 6 to 8 weeks of recovery. He should avoid, Clara said, strenuous activity, explosive impacts, ongoing organized crime conflicts. The surgeon said, yes, all of those, he said. He was asking about you when we put him under, she said. What did he say? The surgeon said. He said to make sure you were all right, she said. Can I see him? The room was quiet and clean and had a window that was beginning, as she entered, to show the first gray light of morning accumulating at the horizon, thin and preliminary and entirely honest about what it was. Dominic was in the bed, connected to monitoring equipment, still pale but with the specific quality of pale that meant alive rather than the other quality. His eyes opened when she came in, which meant he hadn't been fully asleep. She sat in the chair beside him. He said, you look terrible. She said, you just had abdominal surgery. He said, I've had worse days. She said, have you? He said, no, probably not. She looked at him for a moment. She said, your blood pressure is 118/76. That's the best it's been in 48 hours. He said, good, she said. Dr. Palmer texted me an hour ago. Lily's settings held through the night. The secondary alarm hasn't sounded since 2 in the morning. He said, Eleanor called you. She said, she gave me a number. Yes, he said. She doesn't give her number to many people, she said. I'm a specific kind of useful to her. That's not entirely why. She looked at him. He said, you gave her something to work with that wasn't violence. That's not a resource Eleanor has had access to. Clara said, she had access to it. She just hadn't identified it as a resource. A silence. The monitoring equipment beeped. The morning light at the window was becoming more committed to itself. He said, your father. She said, I know. He said, I want to say something. She said, say it. He said, he was afraid. I could see it from across the street. He was genuinely afraid and he walked out of that alley anyway. That's not a small thing. She said, no, he said. I've been afraid exactly twice in my adult life. The night Daniel died, and last night in the warehouse, when you weren't in the vault. She looked at him. He said, when you walked out onto that floor. She said, Cross would have negotiated. He said, maybe. But you didn't know that. She said, I knew you were running out of time and I knew I could buy you some. That was what I knew. He said, that's what you always know. She said, it's what I do. He said, Clara. She said, I'm deciding what to do about my father. I'm not decided yet. But I want you to know that I understand the calculus he made. I understand that it was the right move. I'm holding both of those things alongside everything else, he said. Okay, she said. Okay. A longer silence. The comfortable kind, he said. The foundation, she said. Yes. He said, I want to build it properly, not as an abstraction, as a real thing that functions in the actual world, she said. Tell me what you have, he told her. He talked about the financial structure he had been quietly developing for 2 years, the legitimate revenue streams that could support a not-for-profit health foundation, the legal framework, the two lawyers who had been working on it in parallel with everything else. He talked about the neighborhoods he was thinking about, the South Side and the East Corridor, areas with high population density and historically poor healthcare access. He talked about what he wanted it to be. Not charity, not a gesture, but an actual functioning part of the city's healthcare infrastructure. She listened. She said, "You'll need a proper executive director, someone with public health administration experience, who can manage the institutional side," he said. "I know," she said, "and a medical director. Someone the community will trust," he said. "I had someone in mind for that position," she said. "Who?" He said. "You." She looked at him. He said, "Not immediately. Not while any of this is still unsettled. But I'm asking you to consider it." She said, "I'm an ear nurse. I'm good at it." He said, "You're exceptional at it. You're also the person who built a clinic in a storage room in 48 hours, managed a mafia war using pediatric respiratory medicine, and performed field surgery on a warehouse floor with a flashlight and gauze. You have a specific kind of capability that doesn't stay in one room," she said. "That's a large thing to ask." He said, "I know." She said, "I haven't said yes." He said, "I know." She said, "But I haven't said no." He said, "I'll take that." She stood up. She stretched, feeling the accumulated physical evidence of the past 24 hours in every muscle. She said, "Sleep, 6 to 8 weeks. No exceptions." He said, "Yes, nurse," she said. "I mean it," he said. "I know." She went to the window. The morning light was now genuine, thin and pale and clear. The kind of morning light that had no pretension about itself. She looked at it and thought about the next step, and the one after that, and the shape of what the next weeks would look like. And she thought, "I can work with this." She thought, one thing at a time. She always has had. 6 months later, the clinic opened on a Tuesday in early spring, in a building on the south side of the city that had been, over its life, a grocery store, a community center, and then nothing in particular for several years. 4 rooms plus a waiting area. The walls were painted a shade of soft blue that Clara had chosen after more deliberation than she would admit. Standing in the empty rooms with paint chips in her hand, testing each one against the light at different times of day. The shade she settled on was warm without being sentimental. The blue of clear sky in the late afternoon. The kind of color that said, "This is a calm place, but not a complacent one." The equipment was good, solid, the kind of gear that would still be working in 10 years if properly maintained, which was the standard Clara had specified when the procurement lists were assembled. She arrived at 6:45 in the morning on the first Tuesday. She made coffee on the machine in the back office and sat with it in the waiting room, which was quiet and still had the smell of fresh paint and new upholstery. And she looked around at what had been built from a conversation in a hospital recovery room at 7 in the morning and 6 months of work by people who had believed in it enough to make it real. The clinic operated under the Vance Community Health Foundation, which was a legitimately chartered nonprofit with an endowment, a board of directors, and a legal structure that had consumed the professional attention of 3 lawyers for 4 months. The board included 2 former city health commissioners, a retired pediatric specialist, and a community organizer named James who had been fighting for exactly this clinic on exactly this block for 7 years, and who had cried when the lease was signed, very briefly and with no apparent embarrassment. The executive director was Patricia, 54. With 30 years in public health administration and the specific energy of someone who had been waiting her entire career for the resources to match her competence. She wore reading glasses on a beaded chain and arrived each morning 10 minutes before Clara and left each evening 30 minutes after. Clara was the medical director. She had taken 3 weeks to decide, which was 2 weeks longer than Dominic had expected and 1 week shorter than she had intended. She had made a list of everything she would be leaving, which was significant. She had made a list of everything she would be building, which was also significant. She had called her pediatric respiratory specialist contact, who had been sending her guidance on Lily's management for 5 months, and had asked him for a frank assessment of whether this was a reasonable professional decision. He had said, "Clara, you have been doing 3 people's worth of work for 10 years in a system that keeps reducing its support. If someone is offering you resources to do your work properly, take them." She had taken them. Mercy General had given her a farewell that she had found genuinely difficult to receive. The trauma bay assembled informally during a shift change. A cake that someone had made rather than bought. The particular warmth of people who respected each other without having to say so, and who were saying it anyway because the occasion called for it. She had cried in the hospital bathroom after, and then washed her face and gone back and eaten her cake. The clinic's first day had 14 patients. By the end of the first week, the appointment log was full 2 weeks out. Patricia added 2 more appointment slots per day, and those filled within 48 hours. James, the community organizer, walked through the neighborhood with a stack of clinic information cards and came back the first afternoon having given out all 500 of them. Word traveled fast in neighborhoods that had been underserved too long. Sarah Jenkins came back on the 3rd day. She had called Clara in the weeks after everything resolved itself. During the period, Clara was recovering from what she was privately calling the worst 2 weeks of her adult life, which included the loss of her father and the particular exhaustion of surviving several genuinely dangerous situations in rapid sequence. The call had been brief and careful. Sarah's voice having the quality of someone who was not sure if they were allowed to call, but who could not call. Clara had said, "Come over." She had brought Eli and Mara, who were 9 and 7 now, and who immediately found the crayon set in Clara's kitchen and began drawing at the kitchen table with the unself-conscious focus of children who had been somewhere unfamiliar and decided within 90 seconds that it was fine. Clara and Sarah had talked for 3 hours. Not about the event itself, not primarily. About the years before it, the texture of the friendship, the things that had made it real, and the ways the real things had also made the betrayal possible. Clara talked about her father, which she had not been ready to do with anyone until that evening. She talked about the clear eyes and the lighter, and the decision that had been made before she'd seen it being made. She said at one point, "You protected your children. I understand that. It's not the same as being okay with it, but I understand it." Sarah said, "Are you eventually going to be okay with it?" Clara said, "I don't know. I think I'm going to be okay with you," which isn't exactly the same thing, but it's what I have right now. They had sat with that for a while. Sarah was now the clinic's other full-time nurse. She was at the reception window at 8:45 on the first Tuesday morning, processing the first official patient with the brisk, warm efficiency that had always been one of her particular gifts. The patient was a woman in her late 60s who had been referred by James and who had not seen a doctor in 4 years because the nearest clinic that accepted her insurance was 9 bus stops away, and she had arthritis that made the bus stops difficult. Clara conducted the intake herself. She had blood pressure readings she didn't like, blood sugar numbers that needed investigation, and a story that Clara had heard in variant form 1,000 times in the ER. A person who had been making do for too long, because the alternative required resources they didn't have. She said, "We're going to sort this out. Starting today." The woman said, "I wasn't sure this place was real." Clara said, "It's real." She said it simply, without performance. Martinez came at noon for his follow-up appointment, which he had been maintaining with the reliability of someone who had been told once, clearly, why it mattered and had decided to take the information seriously. His blood pressure reading was 128/81, the best she had seen from him. She said, "Keep doing exactly what you're doing." He said, "Yes, ma'am," she said. "How is everyone at the—" She stopped. he said. The transition has been complicated. But they're managing, she said. Good. Transition was what the people who worked in Dominic's operation called the 6 months that had happened while Dominic was recovering, and the formal negotiated settlement with Eleanor Sterling was being finalized. The shipping network had been resolved through a revenue-sharing arrangement that both parties had arrived at after 11 weeks of negotiation. Managed by Dominic's lawyers and Eleanor's lawyers in rooms that neither principal attended, the violence had, as far as Clara could tell, stopped. Not because violence had become impossible or because the people involved had become different kinds of people, but because the calculation had changed, and the people involved were, above all, calculating people. The 19-year-old woman, the one with the wrongly set finger, was now working in the Foundation's administrative office answering phones. Martinez had told her this 3 weeks ago, and she had written it in her patient log under administrative notes, which she was aware was not the intended use of that section, but which felt right to her. Dominic came at 5 in the evening. The last appointment had left at 4:45. Sarah had gone to pick up her children from school. Patricia was in her office reviewing next week's scheduling. The clinic was in the particular quiet of a place that had done what it was supposed to do for a day and was resting between. He came through the front door in lighter clothes than she had ever seen him wear before, a pale gray shirt with no tie, dark trousers that were somehow less armored than his usual presentation. He still moved the way he had always moved, with the complete spatial awareness of someone for whom being unaware of a room had always been a luxury he couldn't afford. But something in it was different, slightly looser. More like someone inhabiting his own body, and less like someone occupying strategic space. He looked around the clinic. He said, "It's good," Clara said. "It's excellent, actually," he said. "Yes, that too," he said. "Patricia tells me the appointment log is full for 3 weeks." Clara said, "She's adding hours." "We're going to need another nurse within 6 months," he said. "Tell me what you need," she said. "That's not how the foundation works. You fund it. Patricia runs it. I run the clinical side. You don't get to be in the room for operational decisions," he said. "I know." He said it without resistance. She looked at him for a moment. She said, "Lily's appointment is Thursday," he said. "I know." "Eleanor mentioned it," she said. "She's been added to the transplant evaluation list. The specialist thinks she could move to active status within 3 months if her current trajectory holds," he said. "Eleanor told me," she said. "Are you and Eleanor talking?" He said. "We are in a state of continued negotiations that occasionally includes direct conversation. It is not comfortable, but it is happening," she said. "That counts for a great deal," he said. "Millimeters of progress," she said. "Millimeters are still progress." She moved around the desk and checked the supply log she'd been updating before he arrived. She crossed off 2 items and added 3 to the order list for next week. He said, "I visited the site." She knew which site. The alley on the south waterfront block, which the city had cleared, and which was now just an ordinary patch of urban ground between 2 ordinary buildings. She said, and, he said, there was nothing. "To market. I'm working on something. I have someone designing something appropriate," she said. "Tell me about it when it's done." He said, "I will," she said. "He would have thought it was too much," he said. "Probably," she said. "He would have been wrong." She finished the supply log. She straightened the patient charts on the desk. She picked up her jacket. She said, "The foundation board meets Thursday morning. Patricia wants to discuss the second location," he said. "East side. The building on Meridian Avenue," she said. "You know which building she means," he said. "Of course I know which building she means," she said. "She's been trying to secure it for 3 years and keeps running into the same bureaucratic obstacle with the property management company." He said, "That obstacle can be resolved," she said, "legally." He said, "The resolution is legal. The process by which I facilitate the legal resolution is not entirely formal," she said. "I don't need to know the details." He said, "No, you don't," she said. "But the outcome is the building." he said. The outcome is the building, she said. All right. She put on her jacket. She picked up her bag. She stood in the middle of the clinic, in the warm blue light of the space they had built, and she looked at him. He looked back at her. She thought about the auction house, the velvet and the smoke and the gunfire and the alcove and a mouth pressed to hers in the dark, and the cold night air when she'd run out of the emergency exit, and the absolute certainty she had felt that it was over and she was safe. She thought about how wrong she had been. She thought about the compound and the storage room clinic and the conversation over a suture kit about who deserves to live. She thought about the warehouse and the vault and the ventilation grate and her bloody hands and the concrete floor and the industrial light. She thought about her father's face. She thought about what had been built in the 6 months since, what was still being built, what was still possible and complicated and real. He was still watching her. She had the thought that she sometimes had about him now, the thought she was still getting accustomed to, which was that he was the most complicated person she had ever known and also the most honest one, about the things that mattered. He had never once, in all of it, pretended to be something he wasn't. He had been what he was and he had been trying, consistently, with the same totality he brought to everything, to become something more than that. She found that she trusted him, not completely. Trust of that particular totality was something she was building carefully, the way you build anything structural, with proper materials and the right sequence and no shortcuts. But she trusted him, actually trusted him, in the way that was different from finding someone predictable or useful. He stepped forward. He put one hand against her jaw, gently, with the care of someone who has learned gentleness as a practice, rather than an instinct and is committed to the practice. She put her hand over his. He kissed her. It was nothing like the first time. The first time had been strategy and fear and a stranger's calculations in a dark alcove. This was deliberate and honest and entirely free of any other purpose. And it had in it the warmth of two people who had seen each other in the worst conditions available and had not looked away, and who had decided that what they saw was worth something. She pulled back a little. She said, "You're still one of the most complicated people I've ever met." He said, "Yes," she said. "You're going to make things difficult in ways I can't predict." He said, "Almost certainly." She said, "But you're trying." "I believe you're trying," he said, "every day." She said, "That's enough." She stepped back and held the door open. He walked out into the evening, which was the kind of spring evening that reminded the city of itself. Warm air, long light. The particular quality of early spring in an urban place where the season had to work harder to make itself known and did. Clara locked the clinic door. She stood on the front step for a moment. The neighborhood was alive with its ordinary evening life. A group of teenagers on the corner, talking over each other in the way of teenagers everywhere. A man walking a dog that was too large for the leash he'd chosen, but didn't seem to know it. Music from an open window. Something with a good rhythm. A woman across the street loading groceries from a cart, pausing to look at the clinic's with the expression of someone seeing it for the first time. Clara watched the woman look at the sign. The woman took out her phone. She photographed the hours on the door. She put the phone back in her pocket and resumed loading her groceries. But in the way of someone who has registered something and will come back to it, she would call on Thursday. She would be the clinic's 47th patient. Clara stepped down from the step and fell into pace beside Dominic on the pavement. They walked. The city moved around them, ordinary and indifferent and entirely itself. And the clinic light caught the spring evening behind them and scattered it, throwing a warm rectangle of light onto the pavement of the block, small, specific, real, 1 block away, in a building on Archer Street. A man named George, whose wife had been telling him for 2 years to see a doctor, was looking at the clinic card that James had left in his mailbox that morning. He was 61 years old. He had not seen a doctor in 4 years because the cost and the distance and the time had always been the reasons. He was looking at the card with the particular attention of someone who was seriously considering doing something. He would make an appointment on Wednesday. He would be the clinic's 52nd patient. His wife would come with him. 2 streets over. A mother was reading the information sheet James had put in the community center bulletin board to her 8-year-old son, who had asthma that had been managed on expired inhalers from a pharmacy 6 miles away because the local pharmacy didn't carry his brand. The mother was reading the sheet with the focused attention of someone who has learned to read everything carefully before believing it. She would call on Friday. She would be the clinic's 58th patient. Her son would be the 59th. These were not extraordinary people. They were people who had been in ordinary circumstances that made ordinary things difficult, who had needed something simple and had not had access to it, who had been waiting, without necessarily knowing they were waiting, for something to change. Clara Hayes did not know any of this yet. She would know it by the end of the next week, when Patricia's intake reports began to tell the story of who was coming through the door, and from what distance and with what needs. She would sit with that report in the back office, with her coffee going cold beside her, and she would read it the way she read everything that mattered, all the way through, without skipping the parts that were difficult. She would feel something that did not have a single name: grief, because everything that should have been available to these people was not, and had not been, and would not have been without the specific chain of catastrophic events that had led to this room being built. Gratitude, because the room was built. Something past both, in the space where grief and gratitude coexisted without resolution. She would write the patient total in her notebook. She would underline it once. She would close the notebook. She would go back out to the clinic floor. Because the work was there, and the work was real, and the work was what she had always known how to do, and had always known was worth doing. Because 10 years in an emergency room had taught her that the system could fail people in 100 ways, and that the response to that failure was not to be consumed by it, but to show up, reliably, in the small and specific place where you could be useful, and to be useful there, completely and without reservation, for as long as you were able, one patient at a time. That was always how it started. That was always what it was. She walked with Dominic through the spring evening, and behind them, the clinic light stayed on for another 20 minutes before the timer switched it off. And in those 20 minutes, 3 more people paused in front of the door to read the hours. And one of them wrote down the phone number, and the city went on doing what cities do. And Clara Hayes went home, and she was not safe, exactly in the way she had once understood safety. The uncomplicated kind you had before you understood what you were capable of losing. But she was something better than safe. She was present, and useful, and building something. And standing next to someone who was building something too. She was herself. That had always been enough. That had always been more than enough. Before we close, I want to stay here for a moment. Because a story like this one deserves more than just an ending. It deserves an honest conversation about what it was actually trying to say. On the surface, this is a story about a mafia boss and a nurse. About gunfights and underground auctions and a city divided by people with too much power and too little accountability. And all of that is real. And all of that is here. But underneath all of it, at the core of every scene and every choice and every line of dialogue, this story was asking one question, and it asked it over and over again from the first chapter to the last. What is a human life actually worth? Not in the abstract, not as a philosophical position, but in practice, in the room, on the table. When the person in front of you has done things you disagree with, or has hurt people you love, or exists on the opposite side of a line you have drawn for yourself. What does a human life weigh then? Do the scales tip differently based on who is on them? Clara Hayes answered that question the same way every single time. Every person who came to her table had equal weight. Not because she was naive about what those people had done, not because she approved of them, or trusted them, or had forgiven everything they had brought into the room, but because the moment she began assigning different values to different lives based on her own judgment of their worth, she would lose the thing that made her work meaningful. She would stop being a healer and start being an arbiter. And the world, she understood, had enough arbiters. It did not have enough healers. That is the first lesson. And it is not a small one. The second lesson lives in Dominic Vance. Here is a man who built an empire on the foundation of one terrible night. The night he sat helpless, while his 17-year-old brother died of something that should have been survivable. Died because the system looked at his family and calculated that they did not have enough to be saved. Dominic spent 20 years making sure he would never be that powerless again. He built control. He built leverage. He built a world in which he moved every piece and no one moved him. And from the outside, it looked like strength. But Clara could see, from the beginning, that it was the shape of an old wound that had never been properly closed. Power built from fear is not freedom. It is just a different kind of trap with better furniture. What changed him was not love in the simple sense. It was the specific confrontation with someone who refused to be moved by the architecture of fear he had spent 20 years constructing. Clara did not fear him the way others feared him. She assessed him. She treated him. She told him the truth about what he had built and what it had cost. And in doing that, she gave him something no amount of control had ever given him, a mirror that was honest. The third lesson belongs to Arthur Hayes, a man who spent most of his adult life losing, who made the same catastrophic choices in slightly different arrangements for 20 years, who cost his daughter more than anyone should cost the people who love them. He was not a good man in the accounting sense. The ledger does not balance. But he was also the man who walked out of an alley in the middle of a firefight, afraid and clear-eyed at the same time, and made the only choice that was left to him that meant something. We are not the sum of our worst moments. We are also the sum of what we do when the moment finally arrives that cannot be negotiated, bargained, or gambled away. Arthur Hayes found his moment. He took it with both hands. And finally, the lesson of the clinic. The small blue room on the south side of the city, full of ordinary people who had simply needed something ordinary for a very long time and had not had access to it. The story did not end with a grand gesture or a symbolic resolution. It ended with a woman walking into a room and saying, "This is where I work now, and here is what I can do, and I am going to do it for as long as I am able." That is not a dramatic ending. It is a true one, because real change almost never announces itself. It shows up quietly, at 6:45 in the morning, with a coffee going cold and a patient log waiting to be filled. We are more than the worst things done to us. We are more than the worst things we have done. And the space between who we have been and who we are capable of becoming is not fixed. It is open. It is always open. That is what this story believed. That is what it was trying to say. This content was researched, built, and manually edited to bring you meaning and lessons worth carrying.